Hi everyone, we hope you're doing well. We're hanging in there though honestly, we haven't been getting much sleep lately. Today, we want to answer a question we get a lot: how do we publish our audiobooks? First, we post most audiobooks on Patreon as paid content. They stay paid for a few months. After that, they become free to listen to on Patreon forever. A few weeks later, we post them on other places like YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter, X. Lately, things have been a bit slow in terms of new members. So we'd love your help. Please share our site with your friends or in places like Facebook groups, Twitter, X, Discord, Reddit, or novel forums. Even one share can really help us grow. Thanks so much for your support. Chapter 1, Introduction. Eric sat in the middle of his history course with a bored expression on his half-asleep face. As his silver eyes gazed out the window of the classroom, he could faintly hear his teacher's monotone voice as it droned on about a subject he was all too familiar with. A holographic projection appeared in the center of the classroom, which the teacher interacted with as he delved through the Milky Way galaxy to find the target of his interest until finally a small star system appeared within the sight of everyone who was privy to this lecture. The moment these high school seniors, who were only 3 days away from graduation, laid their eyes upon the small continental world whose crust was filled with oceans, they groaned in lament, knowing exactly what their teacher was about to tell them. This did not deter the instructor, who began his speech with a fit of passion that was relatively unfamiliar to those in the audience. Who can tell me what this planet right here is? Anyone? How about you, Silver? Eric sat upright, upon hearing the derogatory nickname that even his family referred to him as, before giving the answer that the teacher was looking for. Earth. An unusual smile spread across the teacher's face, as he spoke with such zeal that his students thought that perhaps the man in front of them was actually a doppelganger. Correct. This is Earth, the world our ancestors fled from nearly 400 years ago. Can anybody tell me why this was the case? Despite everyone in the class knowing the answer, as this propaganda had been drilled in their heads since they were small children, nobody dared raise their hand, perhaps out interest in just what had gotten this old man so fired up for the first time since they had begun taking his courses 4 years ago. Upon seeing that nobody wanted to answer the question, the teacher began to explain the origins of their empire as the holographic projection shifted from a view of the Earth to various scenes that were more appropriate for an adult audience. Whether it was graphic violence, usage of illicit substances, or outright sexually suggestive material, the class witnessed the decadence of humanity in the years leading up to the Great Exodus. All while the teacher summarized the content. The year is 2125, and humanity has just discovered the warp drive. For the past 200 years, humanity had been progressing on a path of self-destruction. Everyone, no matter how foolish or malicious they may have been, were given political power, in the form of suffrage. This foolish idea had disastrous consequences as society had spiraled into decadence and conflict. Now, I know this is hard to believe considering that we have all but eliminated these aspects from our society. But imagine, if you will, a world where you are forced to lock your doors at night. A world where you must keep arms in your home to protect yourself and your family from your neighbors. Theft, murder, and rape had become a daily aspect of living on Earth in the 22nd century, and one did not know when they would become a victim of their fellow man. Drugs and alcohol were widespread, to the point where even the youth could not escape their poison. And perhaps the most diabolical aspect of it all was the sexual revolution, which led to the destruction of the family unit. Upon saying this last part, the instructor shivered in visible disgust, clearly finding the sexual revolution to be the most disgusting part of human history. He then continued to rant on about his lecture with the same fiery voice he used prior to this interruption. Needless to say, this society could not last long. And thus by the time the warp drive was invented in 2125, the civilizations that our ancestors had built were on the verge of total collapse. In his infinite wisdom, the first supreme leader of our empire made use of this new technology to escape from the decadence and decay of humanity. Our ancestors followed the supreme leader into the stars in search of a new home, which we found in the world we now know as Germania, but during those days, it was simply referred to as Kepler 452b. In the following centuries, our ancestors built a society that could stand the test of time, and the horrors of the vast universe. Through the sacrifice of our ancestors, we have become a regional power. So remember this, as you all venture out into your mandatory military service. Civilization is built upon self-sacrifice. The idea that I am willing to give up something for my family to succeed, and that my family is willing to give up something so that the nation can succeed. Self-sacrifice is the first principle of civilization. So go forth and make our empire great. The bell rang immediately after the teacher's speech ended, causing Eric and the rest of his classmates to rise from their seats. Schools were segregated based upon sex in the Germanic Star Empire, and thus the entire class was filled with young men. However, despite this fact, Eric stood out from all of his peers. Why was this the case? Well, that was because of his unusual appearance. In the Germanic Star Empire, all infants were genetically enhanced to become superhumans. However, the result of this enhancement could have certain side effects or mutations. As part of his gene therapy, Eric was superior to a baseline human in every way. He was taller, stronger, smarter, more agile, and capable of greater physical and mental feats. However, unlike his peers, who all had blonde hair and blue eyes, he was a mutant with silver hair and eyes. A mutation that just barely allowed him to exist, for if a far more taboo mutation had occurred, he would have been terminated upon birth. Despite being deemed unfit for termination, Eric had always been discriminated against because of his unique appearance. Thus, as he walked out of the classroom, he was physically accosted by some of his classmates. "Where do you think you're going, Silver? You're 18 now. Which means you must have gotten your monthly stipend. If you know what is good for you, then you will transfer the balance into my account. It is not like a mutant like you have even been assigned a wife." That's right, in this fascist society, even something as intimate as marriage was determined by the state. Usually as a result of genetic compatibility, though sometimes for propaganda purposes. A mutant like Eric would never be allowed to get married, or pass on his defective genes. Thus, his stipend, which was designed to help citizens financially support their families, had no meaning for a man like him, and yet he was entitled to it as a citizen of the empire all the same. It was no wonder that these bullies wanted him to cough over his money. Probably so they could spend it on some lavish gifts for their young fiancés. In the Germanic Star Empire, men and women married young, and had families shortly thereafter. Especially when military service was compulsory for all men who had just entered the age of adulthood. These men who would die in pursuit of the empire's glory would be married first, and only after their wives had conceived a child would they be shipped off to combat. Despite knowing all of this, Eric did not simply hand over his stipend. Even if he had no valid use for it, money was money, and since he did not yet have a job, this was the only income he could get his hands on. Thus, he would be damned before he handed it over to some random asshole. In that moment, Eric closed his eyes and opened his mind to the possible outcomes of the actions he planned to take. In an instant, a premonition flashed in his mind about the next 7 seconds. Whether he would win the fight, flee, or get his ass beat. The outcome of his premonition was something that only Eric could see, as it was a special ability, gifted to him through his gene therapy. Thus, after witnessing the immediate future unfold in his mind, he chose one possible future and acted according to the vision. Eric's hand moved so swiftly from his side that the leader of the bullies did not even have time to react before he was punched in the throat. An act which dropped the young man to his knees, which Eric immediately responded to by kneeing his victim in the head, knocking him out cold. After knocking out their leader in an instant, the other two boys were bewildered, but rather than stand and fight them, Eric fled through the halls of the school, dashing faster than his opponents as he narrowly avoided their takedown attempts. Eventually Eric made his way to the parking lot, where he climbed into his hover car, and took off to the skies, fleeing the scene of his crime entirely unscathed. As he looked out the rear window, he flipped off the boys who were left in his dust, before cursing them in their own minds with his second ability, telepathy. "Get fucked, cunts." Seeing that Eric had gotten away, the bullies went back to retrieve their leader, who was lying face first on the floor of the school's hallway. Eric swiftly returned to his home, where he disembarked from his hovercraft, and entered through the doors of the large mansion. The man had 9 siblings, of which he was the oldest. Yet despite the fact that many of his brothers and sisters were already home, not a single one of them greeted Eric as he walked through the halls of their home with a stoic expression on his young and handsome face. It was not until he reached the doors of his room, and encountered his younger sister, Heidi, that someone finally spoke to him. "Oh, shit, look who is back." Heidi was dressed in a lavish evening gown, and had an expensive purse in her hands. Her hair was dolled up for the evening, while her face was caked with makeup. It was clear that the girl was about to go out with her fiancé to some fancy dinner. The very thought of which made Eric feel bitter inside, causing him to lash out with a sharp tongue. "Yeah, I'm back, like you give a shit. If you don't mind, I have some studying to do." This response elicited a snort from Heidi's mouth, who responded to her brother's statement in a conceited tone. "Study? Really? Since when have you ever bothered studying? Honestly, father must have pulled a serious favor with someone important to get you inoculated with a grade S serum when you were born. It is a pity that you ended up a mutant because of it. But at the very least, you are physically and mentally superior to most of your peers. I bet you are even graduating at the top of your class, aren't you? Or you would be, if they allowed mutants like yourself to hold such an honor. Such a waste. Anyway, dearest brother, I am off to go meet up with Jurgen. Oh, and by the way, be prepared to receive a scolding from mother. She found your contraband when cleaning your room. The moment Eric heard his sister's final words, he felt as if his spine had been dipped in ice. Mother had found his contraband? That was not good. Not good at all. In the Germanic Star Empire, porn was illegal. It was neither permitted to be produced nor possessed. At the same time, sex outside of marriage was strictly prohibited. When both of these were taken into account, Eric in particular had a hard time settling his masculine urges, because he was a mutant and would never be permitted a wife. Thus, he had taken a risk, and illegally imported some pornography from one of the neighboring alien civilizations. After all, the Great Ana Empire had a thriving pornography industry, and they were relatively close to baseline humans in appearance, albeit with horns on their heads. For his mother to find these items, he was in for a world of trouble. With this in mind, the moment Eric opened the door to his bedroom, he braced himself for the scolding he was about to receive from his mother, who was undoubtedly sitting in his room, waiting for him to return home from school. Chapter 2, Coffin Jockey. The door slowly crept open to Eric's bedroom, where, as he suspected, his mother was sitting on his bed with a scowl on her otherwise gorgeous face. Though she was in her late 30s, Krista Yeager appeared as if she were not much older than her son, who was already 18 years old. This was because of the gene therapy that all Germanic citizens underwent at birth, which increased things like physical attractiveness, strength, agility, intelligence, fertility, and, most importantly, lifespan. The average lifespan among the Germanic Star Empire was 250 years, most of which was spent in youth and fertility. Because of this, Germanic families tended to be quite large, as it was considered a duty to the state to do so. Krista's piercing blue eyes settled themselves upon her errant son, as he stood at attention before her as if the woman were his drill sergeant. Awkward silence existed between the mother and son for several moments before Krista began to yell at her son in a voice so loud it could be heard throughout the entire mansion. "What the hell were you thinking? Do you have any idea how much trouble you would be in if anyone found out about these hollow recordings? For fuck's sake, Eric, you are an aberrant, which means the law will be much more strict with you if you ever get caught stepping out of line. Honestly, are you trying to give your mother a heart attack?" Eric did not even bother to argue with his mother, or attempt to justify his actions. Out of all of his family members, the only one who even cared the slightest amount for his well-being was his mother, and because of that, the woman had earned his respect. The fact that she had used the scientifically correct term to refer to his condition as well as scolding him about the danger such a crime posed to his well-being, and not how it would affect his father's political career, showed this sentiment. Thus, all he could do was apologize. "I'm sorry, mother." The beautiful woman who had the appearance of a 20-year-old simply sighed and shook her head, before further commenting on her son's choice in contraband. "Honestly, Eric. Girls? You know how the Empire feels about miscegenation. You would probably get an even harsher sentence simply due to the fact that the women in these hollow recordings are not even Germanic. As harsh as the government is on vice, there is still an underground porn industry, which would have been a safer bet. Lord knows your father has been hunting those degenerate bastards down for some time now. If his superiors were to find out that his own son was in possession of such contraband, it could damn well ruin his career. But I don't really care about that. I just want you to be safe. Promise me you won't purchase any more videos like this." Eric could only sigh and nod his head in agreement with his mother's words. With his power of telepathy, he could read the woman's thoughts, and because of this, he knew she meant every word that she said. "All right, I promise, I won't purchase any more videos like these. So what is my punishment this time?" The woman looked at her son with a disappointed expression on her face before laying down the sentence. "Disconnect from the grid. For the next 3 months, you are not allowed to access it." Eric looked at his mother in disbelief. Did she seriously just demand he cut off all access to the grid for 3 months? The grid was the common term used to describe the interstellar network. It was essentially the internet, but for the entire Germanic Star Empire. In addition to every citizen of the Germanic Star Empire being genetically enhanced at birth, they were also injected with nanites which provided access to grid. In other words, their brains also acted as smartphones. This was useful for a number of applications, chief of which was cloning. If a citizen of the Empire's body perished, especially in battle, their consciousness could be immediately transferred into a clone's body via the grid. A person's thoughts and memories were regularly saved to the grid as backup storage. Thus, by disconnecting from the grid, Krista was not only making her son no longer able to effectively browse the interstellar network, but she was also cutting off his lifeline. If he were to be killed in these next 3 months, only a 3-month-old copy of his consciousness would be transferred to his clone's body, thus robbing him of many memories. Krista could instantly tell that her son was about to debate with her about his punishment, and thus she instantly shot him down before he had the chance by reminding the boy of the sentence he would receive if these hollow recordings were ever to become public knowledge. "Don't argue with your mother, young man. If I showed these videos to your father, He would have you sentenced to a penal battalion for the next 10 years of your life. And that is the minimal sentencing. When you take into account the fact that you are an aberrant, you are likely to serve 25 years. 3 months disconnected from the grid doesn't sound too bad now, does it? Upon seeing that he had no chance of lowering his sentence, Eric sighed heavily before accepting his mother's punishment as law. Alright mother, I will disconnect right now. After saying this, Eric skillfully maneuvered within his own mind to the section of the grid's interface, which allowed him to disable it temporarily. He set it to automatically turn back on in 3 months' time. Something he hoped he would not regret. With her son's punishment starting now, Krista smirked before crushing the hollow recordings with her dainty hands, ensuring that they were ground to dust and unrecoverable. She then kissed her son on the forehead, before walking out of his room, but only after assuring him that everything would be alright. You'll be fine. It is only 3 months. Now get yourself ready for dinner. Your father is coming home tonight, and he will have the results of your conscription by now. It was only after Eric's mother had left the room did the young man sit on his bed and lament his lot in life. His father was no ordinary man. In fact, the man was a sector governor, and spent most of his time off the world, managing the affairs of multiple star systems. In total, the Germanic Star Empire had 36 systems under its control with 100 habited planets. These 36 systems were split into 12 sectors, with an additional 4 over-sectors. If a system governor was the dictator of an entire star system, then a sector governor was the dictator of 3 star systems. In other words, the lives of trillions of people were in the hands of Eric's father. Despite the immense power that the man wielded, he had never shown any favoritism towards his children. The Germanic Star Empire was a society based upon merit. As such, nepotism was a serious offense, even in its most benign forms. Thus, Eric knew that his father had not gone out of his way to get his son a cushy office position in the military, and would have selected his job based upon the Empire's needs, and the position that he was most genetically qualified for. After taking a particularly long shower, where Eric grieved the loss of his precious contraband, he then got dressed in some nice evening wear before approaching the dining room table, where his entire family, aside from his younger sister Heidi, had gathered to greet the head of their household. His mother Krista was looking particularly ravishing, as she went out of her way to look as nice as possible for her husband. Before long, the door opened, and an exceptionally handsome man entered the room with a wide smile on his face. Despite being in his early 40s, Heinrich Jaeger looked not much older than his eldest son. In fact, one might say that Eric inherited his looks from his father, with the obvious exception of his mutated hair and eye color. The man was quite happy to finally return home to his family, where he immediately greeted his wife with a hug and a kiss, before giving his eldest son a firm handshake. Once he had displayed his fatherly affection to all of his children, Heinrich finally spoke. "Something smells amazing? My love, what did you cook for me?" Krista wore a loving smile on her pretty face as she responded to her husband's enthusiasm with the word she knew he yearned for. "I made your favorite, Jagger Schnitzel with a side of Käsespätzle and Kartoffelpuffer." While the Germanic Star Empire descended entirely from Pan-Germanic origins, meaning that they came from countries such as Germany, Austria, Switzerland, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Iceland, England, Liechtenstein, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Eric's family was almost entirely, if not entirely, German in heritage. Because of this, a lot of the recipes that were used to make daily meals came from the fatherland of the Old World. Upon hearing that his favorite meal was being served, Heinrich was quick to inform his family that the time to eat had come. Thus, they all sat down at the table and began to enjoy a nice family meal together. Eventually, after some casual conversation between Eric's father and the rest of his family, the man spoke up about something which would have a direct impact on his eldest son's life. However, when he spoke to Eric, he did so in a voice that was far less enthusiastic than the one he used when conversing with his other children. "So, Eric, you will be graduating from high school in 3 days, yes? I have already filed your conscription notice on your behalf, and I think you will be pleased with the position the party has provided for you." Eric could feel his stomach knotting up at the very thought of being sent into the Star Marines. Germanic Star Marines were the primary infantry unit of the Empire. They were not only genetically enhanced super soldiers, but they were equipped with advanced power armor, turning them into walking tanks. However, the mortality rate among Star Marines was much higher than almost every other unit, specifically because they were fighting the many horrors of the galaxy on foot. And while death was not final to the citizens of the Germanic Star Empire, as in most cases, they could be cloned into a brand new body. The pain and trauma that one suffered upon death were not easily overcome. Thus, Eric crossed his fingers, hoping that he would not be selected for this elite cadre of soldiers. Seeing the look on his son's face, Heinrich knew exactly what the boy was thinking, and scoffed before delivering him news that was perhaps even worse than what he feared most. Congratulations, Eric, you are this family's newest coffin jockey. Eric's heart practically imploded when he heard this news, and while the rest of his siblings snickered at his misfortune, his mother gasped out loud and even dropped her glass in shock. Coffin jockey was a derogatory term for starfighter pilots. In this universe, the only thing that had a higher mortality rate than being a star marine was being a starfighter pilot. Hence the nickname. After all, most battles took place in space before reaching orbit, and there were quite literally a million things that could result in your death if you were flying in a starfighter. Of course, the physical and mental demands for being a starfighter pilot were exceptionally high, and because of this, they were given exceptional benefits and paid to compensate them for their likely demise. Naturally, this meant that Eric would have to go through the Naval Academy and earn himself an officer's commission before he ever even entered pilot school, let alone participated in battle. While the average service length during conscription was 8 to 10 years, officers were required to fulfill a much longer tenure in the armed forces, and because of this, Eric was looking at a solid 15 to 20 years before he could enter either the civilian or political sector. Eric could hardly believe that he had been so unlucky, and immediately felt defeated in his heart. While his siblings took joy in his misery, his mother was devastated, and was quick to ask her husband if there was anything he could do to help their son. "Dear, this can't be right. Eric is not fit for such a dangerous job. Can't you pull some strings to have him made a deck officer?" Heinrich glared at his wife with a furious gaze. Nepotism was a serious offense in the Reich, and his wife had just now suggested he commit it. Thus, he did not hesitate to remind the woman of her place with a particularly foul tone in his voice. "Even if I wanted to do something so scandalous, I would not be able to. The conscription selection process is handled by an advanced artificial intelligence based in the capital. I have no right to interfere with its decision. I know you care about the little mutant, but his fate is out of my hands." After hearing his own father speak such vitriol towards him, Eric no longer felt much like eating, and decided then and there to go to sleep. He abruptly stood up from his seat and departed in silence, without even saying a word. Having fled from the dinner scene, Eric climbed into bed and lamented his lot in life once more, knowing that his future was about to be filled with an unfair degree of pain and suffering. Chapter 3, Graduation Day. 3 days came and went, and before Eric knew it, he had completed the remainder of his classes, as well as his final exams. On the 4th day, he was required to attend his graduation, which was a ceremony which he detested to be a part of. Nevertheless, rules were rules, and though Eric had a history of breaking many of the more petty laws in Germanic society, this was not something so easily skirted. Thus, on the morning of the 4th day, Eric awoke bright and early, where he proceeded to shower and get dressed before approaching the dining room, where his mother was already in the act of preparing his breakfast. Krista appeared in a particularly good mood, as she hummed one of her favorite pop songs, while cooking sausage, eggs, sauerkraut, and pancakes. She also prepared a large glass of fresh milk for her eldest son, who was about to have his big day. While the woman cooked for her family, most of which who were not even awake yet, she watched the news on a holographic projection, paying attention to the latest happenings across the Germanic Star Empire, and beyond its borders. Eric was quite skeptical of the media within the empire, as every network was state-funded and operated. They acted more as a means of propaganda than a distribution of information. Of course, to watch any other source of the news than one that was state-sponsored was a criminal act, and thus the only way Eric had been able to understand what was really going on in the galaxy was through bypassing the national firewall on the grid, and accessing underground news networks. However, since he was currently being punished for owning contraband, he did not currently have access to his usual sources, and thus could only scoff as he heard the Empire's primary news network speak their usual propaganda. This was something that the boy's mother immediately noticed, but did not comment on. Instead, she listened with interest to the reporter, who was speaking about some rather harrowing news in a distant part of the galaxy. And in other news, the world of Rylon 7 has been attacked by the galactic menace commonly known as the Naraku. For those who are not educated about the various alien species of the galaxy, the Naraku are a species of insectoids who are classified as a devouring swarm. This means that they traverse the galaxy in their hive fleets and devour all organic life that they come into contact with. It is believed by the Empire's foremost experts in xenomorphology that the Naraku utilize the organic material which they consume to speed up their evolution, thus making them a particularly troublesome opponent for most interstellar civilizations. However, the Supreme Leader has assured us that this is not an issue we should be worried about, as the Alphaim Dominion has personally dispatched their 5th fleet to deal with these troublesome pests. Not to mention that the nearest hive fleet is several thousand light-years away from our borders. The Empress of the Light Hells has also declared she will use her military might to annihilate any insectoid which dares to enter into her quadrant of space. Eric scoffed once more when he heard this news. What the broadcaster had failed to mention was the fact that most insectoid species were not classified as devouring swarms, and thus were not any larger of a threat than any other species which the Empire came into contact with. The fact that the Empress of the Light Elves declared that she would annihilate every insectoid in her quadrant of space had more to do with the borderline obsession with vanity that her species had, than it did with the actual threat of insectoids. The Light Elves of the Alphaim Dominion were one of 4 major galactic powers, and the territory that fell into their sphere of influence was roughly 1/4 of the Milky Way galaxy. Included in this vast swath of space was the Germanic Star Empire, who were a direct vassal of the Alphaim Dominion. This afforded the Germanic people certain privileges, such as the direct protection of a major galactic power, and the only reason they, or any other species, were able to gain such a privilege would be due to one very specific factor: whether or not the Light Elves found their species to be physically attractive. Though the Light Elves were very similar to the Germanic Star Empire in regards to their views of miscegenation, they were obsessed with aesthetics, and would not sponsor any race they found to be ugly or unappealing. The fact that a recent galactic upstart like the Germanic Star Empire could even survive in the greater galaxy, let alone rapidly expand into a regional power, was specifically because they were a vassal of the Alphaim Dominion. Still, Eric did not really care that much about the lives of insectoids. What he was more concerned about was just how the Alphaim Dominion's 5th Fleet would deal with the Naraka Hive fleet located in their territory. He could not help but comment on this aloud, which was something that drew his mother's ire. "Let me guess, the Alphaim Dominion is going to send their favorite attack dog to do their dirty work, just like they always do." Immediately after saying this, Eric felt his skull get pounded by a synthetic spoon as his mother stood over him with a furious look in her eyes. She was quick to scold her son about his distasteful comments. "How dare you call your own people mere attack dogs? It is the honor of our race to fight for the glory of the Empire. You know as well as I do that for every major victory we gain on behalf of our suzerains, we are rewarded with the terraforming of a new planet. Our people would not be as powerful as they are today without the benefits we gain from this pact. The other races may refer to us as mere attack dogs out of sheer jealousy, but a member of my own flesh and blood will never refer to his people with such a derogatory term." Thinking about what he had said, Eric realized he should have kept his mouth shut. After all, his mother, like nearly every other living citizen in the Germanic Star Empire, was fiercely nationalistic. To the point where even being a common warhound for a superior civilization was a matter of pride. Having chatted with many people from the Great Ana Empire, who were a neighboring civilization and ally of the Germanic Star Empire, Eric had a view of his own people that was more in line with the rest of the galaxy. Something which he would only dare utter aloud around his mother. Or else he would likely be subject to re-education. Thus, Eric apologized to his mother for his crass remarks. Even if he wasn't sincerely sorry for what he had said. "I'm sorry, Mother, I should not have said that." The woman still continued to glare at her eldest son with her ice blue eyes, before finally smiling after several moments of awkward silence. She then placed another sausage on the boy's plate before telling him to get ready for graduation. "All right, finish up your breakfast, and then get your butt to school. I still have to wake up your father and siblings, but I will see you at the ceremony when it begins." Eric wanted to groan upon hearing this. He knew that the only reason his father or siblings would even bother attending his graduation was because his mother was basically forcing them to do so. Regardless of his feelings towards this whole ordeal, he did as his mother had said, and finished his meal before departing for his school. The graduation ceremony began not long after Eric arrived at the venue. He was dressed in his traditional gown and cap. Normally he would be giving a speech as the valedictorian of his class, but because he was a mutant, the position was awarded to someone else. After all, the school could not very well have a mutant representing it on a day such as this. Hell, the fact that he was even allowed to graduate in the first place was a blessing in itself, which was probably only permitted as a sign of respect to his father, who was the sector governor. Eric stood in the crowd waiting for his name to be called. He watched as kids who only knew him by the nickname Silver one by one stood up and received their diplomas. Though there was not really a need for paper products, with everything being in holographic form these days, it was still a tradition, perhaps carried over from the old world to print certain things like diplomas on paper. After all, each of the Empire's worlds were powered by a Dyson swarm and hundreds of antimatter reactors. Because of this, they were never lacking in energy. No matter how much information was recorded and stored on the interstellar network, it would never disappear from society. Eventually Eric's name was called, however, like he suspected it was at the very end of his graduating class. Despite things being in alphabetic order, a mutant would always come last, and thus he stepped forward with a stoic expression on his face, as he received his diploma to the applause of literally one person in the entire audience, his mother. Not even his father or siblings cared enough about Eric to show him their support on a day that would usually be a cause for celebration. Naturally, this caused Krista to pout, which only Eric cared to notice. After receiving his diploma, Eric stepped down from the stage and entered the crowd of other young men who had done the same. He then waited for the speech given by the headmaster of their school, which would be the last bit of propaganda he would have to endure from the old bastard for the rest of his life. Thus, while Eric listened to a long-winded speech about the future of the empire, he yawned and thought about more important matters. I wanted to congratulate all of you young men today, as your childhood comes to an end, and you officially take your place in our great society. Most of you will be spending the next 8 to 10 years of your life in the military, where you will work hard to prove your worth to the empire. Some of you, who have been selected for more prominent positions, may even spend the next 20 years in service to the empire. For that, you have my greatest envy. However, I am sure that after your tenure in the armed forces comes to an end, that each and every one of you will be able to contribute to society in a way that the party has deemed fitting. Whether you become a politician or a simple sanitary worker, you can rest easy, knowing that your lot in life has been decided based on your own abilities. Go forth and bring glory to the empire. Both the audience and the crowd of graduating students broke out into applause as the headmaster concluded his speech. Only one member who was in attendance to witness it half-assed his applause and rolled his eyes. And that was Eric. Luckily, he was just another member of the crowd, and thus nobody witnessed his subtle act of rebellion. After the ceremony was over, Eric returned to his home, where he lied down and rested in his room. Though a party was being thrown for his graduating class by some of the school's alumni, he was not invited. After all, Eric was a mutant, and nobody would voluntarily associate with him if they were given a choice in the matter. Eric would only be given 2 weeks' worth of rest before he was shipped out to the Naval Academy in the Empire's capital, where he would spend the next few years of his life, studying to become an officer in the Imperial Navy. Chapter 4, Traveling to Germania. 2 weeks came and went, and during this time, Eric found that his life was incredibly dull. He had no friends to speak of, at least not in the Empire, and his connection to the grid had been severed, preventing him from speaking with his other friends who dwelled in the neighboring empire. However, on the morning that he was to ship out from his home world of Alemania, to the nation's capital of Germania, his mother was there to greet him. As Eric hauled his cargo out of his room, and towards the garage, where a hovercar was waiting to transport him to the starport, Krista wrapped her arms around her son's back and whispered something in his ears that he had not expected to hear. Remember, my sweet baby boy, even if the world is against you, Mommy still loves you very much, and she knows you will make her proud. The moment Eric looked around to see his mother's face, it was filled with her same loving smile. She was perhaps the only person in the entire world who actually gave a shit about his well-being. The fact that he would be away from his mother for an entire year, before he was permitted to visit her for the holidays, filled Eric's heart with woe. However, he did not say a word of this to his mother, and instead forced a smile and nodded his head, as he placed his luggage inside the back of the hover car, before entering the passenger seat. The vehicle was piloted by an artificial intelligence, and thus there was no need for Eric to actually take the wheel. Just when he was about to order the vehicle to take off towards his destination, a knock resounded on the hull of the vehicle, where the electronic screens, which acted similar to windows, displayed his mother outside trying to get his attention. The woman's voice followed on the speakers as she said something which shocked Eric. "Oh, by the way, Eric, since you are going away to the Naval Academy, feel free to turn the grid back on. I know I said that you are being punished for 3 months, but Mommy wants to hear from you every night when you are done with your studies." Eric could only smile, and this time with genuine happiness, as he did exactly as his mother had said, and turned his connection to the interstellar network back on. Once had done so, he waved goodbye to his mother, before giving the eye the command to take him to the starport. The journey to the starport was a brief one. After all, traffic and vehicles were operated by an advanced artificial intelligence, which completely removed the component of human error. Because of this, traffic accidents were an extremely rare occurrence. In fact, most aspects of Germanic civilization were maintained by artificial intelligence and robots. Everything that could be automated was automated, allowing the citizens of the Germanic Star Empire to pursue more fulfilling careers. Alemania was a frontier world, meaning it existed on the fringes of the Germanic Star Empire. It was named after an ancient tribe of Germanic warriors from the days of the Romans. It, like every other habited planet in the Germanic Star Empire, was classified by the rest of the galaxy as a fortress world. A fortress world was a planet whose entire infrastructure was designed for defense. They were incredibly expensive to build, and most interstellar civilizations had a handful of them within their borders. But to the Germanic Star Empire, who were a martial civilization, hell-bent on defending every inch of ground they conquered until the heat death of the universe, it was considered foolish not to invest in planetary defense. Thus, not only was every aspect of Alemania built to withstand a full-scale invasion by a galactic power, but the entire planet was littered with a variety of turrets, whether they be ion, plasma, or beams. Any location that could be filled with a weapon designed to counterattack against an invading force, you can bet it was. However, despite the fact that Alemania was indeed a fortress world, it was not an ecumenopolis like the core worlds of the Germanic Star Empire were. Thus, there was still some wild fauna and flora in the less inhabited regions of the planet. After arriving in the planet's primary starport, Eric made his way to a large transport spacecraft, which would be taking thousands of citizens to the capital. Many of which were young men like himself who were seeking to begin their military careers. While others were merchants incapable of purchasing their own starships, or any other number of passengers. When Eric got into the cabin, he noticed that it was quite full, and thus, he immediately began to look for the first seat available. Where he noticed that an entire row was available aside from one person who was not a member of the Germanic race at all, but was instead a rare visitor from the neighboring Great Una Empire. As a man who had friends in the neighboring civilization, naturally Eric spoke the language, which he greeted the young woman in her native tongue, thus shocking her, as nobody she had met until this point was able to speak her language. "Excuse me, miss, is this seat taken?" The rather alluring, young Una woman looked at Eric with shock. There were multiple reasons for this, the primary two being that Eric was not only capable of speaking her language, but he did not look like anyone else she had seen in the Empire. Thus, she was quick to ask him just what race he came from. "Not at all. I would be more than happy to sit next to a fellow foreigner." "Which species are you from, friend?" Eric chuckled when he heard this, as he stashed his cargo away in the allotted space before sitting down next to the woman. He was quick to challenge her misconception with a shocking revelation. "I'm actually Germanic myself, however I am an aberrant, so I suppose you could say I am treated the same way, if not worse than a foreigner like yourself." Despite being a foreigner, the Una woman was a regular visitor to the Germanic Star Empire. So much so that she was quite familiar with their society and its many customs. Thus, she knew exactly how rare an aberrant like Eric was, because most were terminated upon birth. The fact that this young man had been deemed unfit for termination meant that he must have lived a life filled with discrimination. She wouldn't doubt if his own family despised him, and thus, with a look of pity on her pretty face, she expressed her sympathy. "You have my condolences, friend. I have been traveling to and from the Germanic Star Empire for many years, and every time I visit, I feel the animosity your kind has towards the rest of the galaxy. Even though our two nations are allies, your people still treat us with the same disdain they do everyone else. I can only imagine what an aberrant like yourself must have endured. My name is Kondo Yumi, what is yours?" Yumi was quite attractive in Eric's opinion, but then again, he may be a bit biased, considering the only porn he had ever watched originated from her homeland. If compared to a baseline human, she looked like a standard Japanese beauty, but with two horns growing out of her head. However, there was most definitely a substantial size difference between the Una and the Germanic peoples. As a result of the Empire's strict eugenic policies, and its mandatory genetic augmentation, the average height of a Germanic male was 195 centimeters, while Eric was only slightly above average at 198 centimeters. As for the average Germanic female, they were 182 centimeters tall. When compared with the Ana, who were of an average Japanese height, Yumi was practically dwarfed by everyone else around her. Yet she appeared the most friendly of the bunch, at least to Eric, who shook her tiny hand while introducing himself. Eric Yeager, it is a pleasure to meet you, Miss Kondo." The Ana beauty slightly giggled as she heard this before complimenting Eric on his manners. "You know, Eric, you must be the most polite man I have met since I first stepped foot in your empire over 100 years ago. Are you sure you are Germanic? I don't mean to sound rude, but out of all the civilizations in which I have been to on business, yours is by far the most hostile." It was Eric's turn to chuckle, as he accepted the woman's words as compliment, before responding to her with a jest. "Sometimes I wonder myself. So you are here in the Empire on business?" The woman nodded her head with a bitter smile on her face. Though she was proud of her accomplishments, she could not say she very much enjoyed doing business with the Germanic Star Empire, thus she decided to vent her frustrations on this young man who seemed to have endured the same discrimination she faced. "Yes, His Highness has requested that I broker trade with your arms corporations. People can say what they want about the GSE, but you guys sure know how to make weapons. I guess there is a reason your race is known as the Alphaim Dominion's Warhounds." Eric chuckled after hearing this and nodded his head in agreement with Yumi's words as she continued on her little rant. "I honestly don't know how a civilization as young as yourselves managed to reach the status of a regional power in such a short amount of time. We spent millennium growing our empire bit by bit, and in the span of 400 years, your race becomes powerful enough for His Highness to consider being a valuable ally. A meager 36 systems, and 100 habited worlds, and yet nobody in this sector of space wants to get on your bad side. Even I must admit, It is impressive what your people have accomplished in such a short amount of time. However, your people are still severely lacking compared to many of the larger regional powers, let alone the galactic powers. Still, I shudder to think of what will become of our quadrant in the next few millennia. You might not be able to witness it, what with your short lifespans, but I'm only 250 years old. By the time I'm an old woman, I will be able to see what has become of the GSE. Eric knew that Una, on average, lived for thousands of years. Though they were not biologically immortal like the Light Elves, they were still long-lived. More so than most interstellar species. In fact, prior to the rise of the Germanic Star Empire, they were the civilization most commonly used by the Light Elves to fight their proxy wars with the other major galactic powers. Both the Germanic Star Empire and the Great Una Empire were highly militaristic and imperialistic civilizations. It was one of the reasons they got along so well, despite the Germanic people's fanatic xenophobia. After venting her frustrations, Yumi looked over and carefully observed Eric. She knew quite a bit about the Germanic species. After all, her job involved trading with them quite regularly, thus she could guess where he was headed to and why. Which she immediately did, much to Eric's surprise. So, I'm guessing you're off to one of your nation's military academies in Germania, huh? I'm a bit perplexed, though. Aren't cadets usually given a 3-month break to become acquainted with their new wives? Judging by today's date, you probably only graduated from high school a few weeks ago. So why are you so desperate to head to Germania? Wouldn't you like to be nice and cozy with your new bride? After all, your race tends to marry young. A bitter smile formed on Eric's face as he looked away from the woman. There was a hint of shame in his eyes as he explained the harsh truth to her. Well, you see, I am an aberrant, or if you want to be insulting, then you can call me by term mutant. That's what most people do. You see, because of my genetic abnormalities, the state has deemed me unfit for reproduction. So I have no wife and will never have a wife. Because of this, they have decided to get me started on my education earlier than my peers, who are not doubt-siring children as I speak. Yumi's mouth fell agape as she looked at Eric with shock in her dark eyes. She had always heard about how strict the Germanic Star Empire was with their citizens' daily lives, going so far as arranging marriages based upon genetic compatibility, but she would never expect them to prohibit a man from marrying, simply because his hair and eye color were different from the norm. As someone who had worked with the Germanic Star Empire for the last 100 years, she knew all too well that sex outside marriage was strictly prohibited, and thus she could not help but ask the question that became most important to her in that moment. Albeit her voice was a bit loud, as she was genuinely outraged at what she was hearing, thus dragging all the attention in the cabin onto herself, even if the other passengers could not understand her. Wait a second? So they expect you to go out and die for the Empire as a virgin? You have got to be kidding me? Please don't tell me you were selected for a dangerous role like a Star Marine. In that moment Eric scoffed and spoke in a voice filled with bitterness, as he still refused to look Yumi in the eye. Oh, I wish I was selected to be a Star Marine. I would have a better chance at surviving if that was the case, and even if I did die, the odds of me being successfully cloned would be much higher. No, I was selected to become a starfighter pilot. So the odds of me dying throughout the next 20 years are a near certainty. And if I am beyond the reach of the interstellar network when I do eventually in battle, I'm not coming back. Yumi stared at Eric in disbelief for a long time, as the silence between them continued for what seemed like hours. She had never met a man from the Germanic Star Empire that was so polite and open-minded, and yet he was destined for a fate that she would not wish on her worst enemies. To be used, and tossed aside by his nation as a tool, and without ever experiencing the most basic pleasures in life. In that moment, the Anna businesswoman felt pity for the young man, and bit her lip as she debated something that only she knew within her own mind. After what seemed like a lifetime of indecision, Yumi made a suggestion to Eric that he never thought he would hear in his life. How about when we reach Germania, you come back to my hotel room for some drinks? You don't have to report to the academy immediately, right? I know alcohol is not usually permitted to be consumed in the Empire outside of a certain limit, but as a foreign diplomat, I'm granted an exception. We can drink until you feel better, and then maybe. The next words she spoke were whispered into Eric's ears in a voice so low, only he could possibly hear it. Chapter 5, First Day at the Naval Academy. Eric awoke the next day in Yumi's hotel room. He had only a vague notion of what had transpired the night before. After all, he had drank far more alcohol than what was considered the legal limit of consumption within the Empire. Normally alcohol would have no effect on the man's body, due to the nanites which were swarming in his bloodstream, known more commonly as Neuralink, as well as the genetic enhancements he had received at birth, but he had whitelisted the toxin known as alcohol, allowing him to get drunk for the first time in his life. But one thing was abundantly clear in Eric's mind. He had finally graduated from the status of a virgin boy and had become a man in his own right. As much as Eric feared anyone finding out about what he had just done, Yumi assured him that nobody would be any the wiser, especially the authorities. Evidently, this was not her first time sleeping with a Germanic man, despite the strict penalties associated with the crime of miscegenation, because she was not worried in the slightest that the authorities would investigate their little dalliance. Thus, came an end to their brief relationship, as Yumi gave Eric a slight peck on the lips, before kicking him out of her room, instructing him never to contact her again. From the start Eric knew that no real relationship would come from this one-night stand, but after being given the opportunity to lose his virginity, something he feared he would never be able to accomplish in this life due to his genetic abnormalities, he was more than willing to take Yumi up on her offer. After absconding from Yumi's hotel room, Eric made his way to the Naval Academy, where he was supposed to register the night before as a new cadet. The petty officer at the front desk gave the young man a stern look before scolding him for his tardiness. "Jaeger, huh? It says here in the system that your transport arrived in Germania last night. Why have you waited until now to report for duty?" Normally this was a question that would land Eric in hot water, but Yumi had given him a valid excuse for his tardiness, and thus he did not waver as he explained the situation that had prevented him from arriving at the Naval Academy sooner. "I was held up by a foreign diplomat who requested my support in a personal matter. We met on the flight to Germania. Her name is Kondo Yumi, and she is a representative of the Ana Emperor." The petty officer looked at Eric with suspicion in his blue eyes for several moments in silence. Evidently, he was using the grid to confirm whether or not Eric's story was true. After waiting for no more than 5 seconds, he sighed before reaching into a nearby cabinet where he handed Eric a basket full of various items such as his new uniform, grooming supplies, a change of clothes for physical training, among other things. After doing this, the man informed Eric of which barracks he would be living in for the next 4 years of his life. "I have confirmed your story to be accurate. Although I don't know what a fresh cadet could offer a representative of the Ana Emperor, I have been informed that this matter is not to be investigated any further. Thus, you will not be assigned a punishment for your tardiness. Normally there would be an orientation for the new class of cadets, but since you are 3 months early, due to your abnormality, you will have to wait for the others to arrive. In the meantime, you will report to your barracks in the west wing of the academy, room 526257, where you will get dressed in your new uniform before joining the other mutants in their early classes. After you have completed your duties for the day, you will be given the rest of the night to complete your assigned work before getting some shut-eye. The curfew is 9:30 p.m. You will only get this one warning, so listen carefully. If you are caught outside of your barracks after hours, you will be severely punished. Do I make myself clear?" Eric immediately snapped to attention and saluted the petty officer before responding to his question with a solid voice. "Yes, sir." The petty officer remained stoic as he gave one final order before getting back to his terminal. "Dismissed." Upon hearing this, Eric began to clamber his way through the massive campus, which housed millions of young cadets. Germania was a super-Earth with a radius 50% larger than the Earth, and a surface gravity which was nearly twice the weight of Earth's. Not only was it a significantly larger planet than the world which birthed the Germanic race, but it was also an ecumenopolis, meaning the entire planet was one giant city, much like all the core worlds of the Germanic Star Empire. How was such a giant planet, with trillions of inhabitants, able to sustain itself? Well, for energy concerns they made use of Dyson swarms, and antimatter reactors which provided more than enough power for the planet to function off of for the next few centuries, even if they were to somehow lose access to their means of generating energy. As for means of agriculture, the Germanic Star Empire made use of orbital farms which were scattered across the globe, which provided an ease of transportation to the planet without fear of supply lines being disrupted. Thus, Germania was able to house several giant military academies which were the size of Earth cities from the 21st century. Luckily for Eric, there was free public transport, and a navigation chart of the planet which had been automatically uploaded to his neural link the moment he first stepped foot on Germania. This allowed him to quickly find his way to wherever he wanted to go. As Eric stepped on the hovertrain, which would take him to the barracks, he noticed several other cadets who were several years older than him sitting around and listening to music, which they played for the entire cabin to suffer through. Eric immediately knew what girl group they were listening to, and could not help but groan as he heard the grown men argue about which of the up-and-coming teenage idols were the hottest of the group. "I'm telling you, man, Erica Krieger is a fucking goddess in the flesh. Not only is she just about the most beautiful woman I have ever laid eyes on, but she also has the voice of an angel. And the way she can move her hips, it is fucking unreal. She is quite literally perfect in every way. It is not much of a surprise though, after all, her parents were both exceptional performers in their own rights when they were younger. She definitely deserves the #1 spot in With Love." With Love was a new pop group that had just debuted a few months prior. Its members were all roughly 14 years old, making them appealing to a male audience, specifically because none of them were engaged yet. To Eric, who had a relatively unique taste in music, that being music which was now several centuries old, he could not stand the pop industry, which he saw as just another tool of the empire to keep its population under control. As of late, everywhere he looked, he could see the girls of With Love plastered all over the place. Whether it was on the grid, or in person, he could not get the sight of the pink-haired bimbo out of his mind. Perhaps what infuriated him most about the pop industry was their dyed hair, which was a mockery to a mutant like himself. Members of the entertainment industry were given certain liberties that the other aspects of society were not permitted. As a result, it was quite common for young pop stars to dye their hairs in flamboyant colors, as a way to prove that they were different from everyone else. Eric was discriminated against because of his silver hair, but Erica was beloved by the Empire, partially because her bubblegum pink hair was so different from every other woman on the street. As an actual mutant, born with an abnormality which caused his hair and eyes to be unique, Eric could not help but have disdain for those who would purposely dye their hair an unnatural color, thinking it made them look attractive. His scorn for the young pop star was made apparent by the expression on his face, which caused the other cadets to pause their music and approach him with ill intentions. It had been a while since any of these young men had seen a mutant, and though they first ignored the pitiful creature, the fact that he had dared to insult their goddess could not go unpunished. Thus, the leader of the group approached Eric and grabbed hold of his collar while lifting him up into the air, all while screaming at his victim for showing the slightest disinterest in their conversation. "What's so funny, mutant? Don't tell me you look down on my wife." Despite the aggressive posturing by the older cadet, Eric did not appear the least bit intimidated. Instead, he scoffed with a look of scorn on his handsome face, before scolding the man for being an idiot. "Wife? Please, once that goddess of yours has used up her value to society, she will be sold off to some 300-year-old party member who wants a hot young wife. You are aware that is the fate of most, if not all, of the young women in the entertainment industry, right? Erica is no exception. She has maybe 10 to 20 years left in the industry, before everyone has forgotten about her, and then I feel sorry for whoever has to marry such a brainless bimbo." If Eric could describe the look on the man's face, whose goddess he had just insulted by speaking the truth, it would be like a baboon who had been kicked in the testicles. The man was so enraged by what had just happened that he did not hesitate to punch Eric in the gut. Eric was only slightly above the average Germanic male in terms of size. It was because of this that he was selected to become a starfighter pilot and not a star marine. As for the cadet in front of him, he was clearly chosen for the role of the Empire's most fearsome infantry, because he was over 215 centimeters tall, and easily weighed over 150 kilograms of pure muscle. Even if Eric was enhanced with a superior gene serum at birth, he still felt the impact of the man's fist as it collided with his solar plexus. Thus falling to his knees, as he threw up all the alcohol that was still in his stomach from the night before. As he was heaving on the ground, Eric heard the man curse him out loud, while his friends pulled him away so that he could not further assault the new cadet. Which was an act worthy of expulsion. Impudent little shit. Despite being forced to vomit his stomach contents all over the floor, Eric simply smiled as he wiped the bile from the side of his mouth, before shouting across the train, towards the man who had assaulted him. "You have been here longer than me, so you should know that everything you do in this academy is recorded and observed by the staff. Congratulations, asshole, you will receive an expulsion for assaulting a new cadet. Have fun being a fucking grunt for the next 8 years. I wonder if you will be deployed against the Naraku, though I doubt your genetic material will contribute much to their evolution after they devour you." To be eaten alive by the Naraku was quite possibly the biggest fear of a star marine. There was nothing more embarrassing and dishonorable than dying in such a way. Even if they did manage to get cloned back into existence, the shame of being eaten by a fucking bug would never be washed off their record. Thus, in an act of rage, the large cadet broke out of the grips of his comrades, and rushed towards Eric, before punching him in the face, knocking him to his knees, where the silver-haired man continued to laugh at and taunt the brute who was assaulting him. "Oh sure, dig yourself into a deeper pile of shit. You will definitely be sent into a penal battalion to fight against the bugs now." Eventually, the train came to a stop, where the comrades of the large brute pulled him off the train, leaving Eric black and blue. However, this lasted only for a minute, before his body began to regenerate, which was an effect of both the nanites in his bloodstream, and the genetic serum he had received at birth. As quickly as he had received the injuries, so too did they disappear, leaving Eric spotless as he chuckled. He had been at the Naval Academy for less than an hour, and already he was starting trouble. He wondered how his father would react when he received the news. One thing was certain, the next 4 years of his life were going to be interesting. Chapter 6, a lecture on galactic politics. After being assaulted on the train, and detained by the authorities for questioning, A harsh sentence was given to the man who had attacked Eric. Though the silver-haired lad was a mutant, he was still protected by the law in such a blatant and open case of assault. Thus, the brute of a cadet was expelled from the Naval Academy. However, his punishment was not as severe as it would normally be, specifically because Eric was a mutant. Rather than serve the rest of his mandatory military service in a penal battalion, where he would wage war against the Empire's worst enemies, without all the equipment that Star Marine would have to protect himself. The brute was sent into the Corps as an enlisted soldier, and though this had effectively killed any chance he might have at making a career out of politics, it did not bar him from any great feats in the civilian sector later in life. Still, Eric was fine, just knowing that he had ruined the man's chance of ever becoming a planetary governor, not that an impulsive and violent thug like him would ever make it far in the Empire's politics. The Germanic Star Empire was an absolute meritocracy, where only those with the skill, intelligence, and know-how managed to get far in life, regardless of their age. One could easily rise through the ranks of the Empire if they were exceptional enough. Just look at Eric's father, Heinrich. The man was in his early 40s, which was still considered being barely an adult by the standards of the Empire, who had an average lifespan of 250 years, and yet he was already a sector governor. This had not happened because the man knew the right people, or was born into a powerful family, but because he performed exceptionally on the battlefield as a naval officer. His feats were so extraordinary that after spending a few months in office as a planetary governor he was promoted to the position of a system governor, and after 2 years fulfilling that role, he became a sector governor, replacing the man who was previously in his position, who had proven to be inferior to Heinrich. That was how the Germanic Star Empire functioned. The most fitting man got the job, while the rest served loyally, and fearfully. Now cases like Heinrich were extremely rare, and most men spent decades of their life, if not over a century, climbing to such a lofty position, if they could reach it at all. However, criminals were treated with a unique disdain by the party. They were hated even more so than mutants. If one had a criminal record, they could never serve in the office of politics. After dressing in his military uniform, and cleaning himself up a little, Eric departed from his barracks and entered his first classroom at the academy, whose seats were almost entirely empty. The only people who were currently taking classes on campus were the mutants, who did not get the 3-month break that everyone else had in the summer. While this made it so the mutants could graduate earlier, it was not treated with pride, but rather ridicule and contempt by their peers. Because they were not able to sire a family. Eric immediately noticed that the mutants in the class were not that much distant from the baseline Germanic male. Most of them simply had unique eye and hair colors, much like himself. All serious mutations like those that would change the pigment of one's skin, or perhaps those that would add a third eye, or a tail, or any number of bizarre features, were deemed fit for termination upon birth, and the infant child who displayed these genetic abnormalities would be euthanized and cremated. There were perhaps 20 other mutant cadets in this class. Which, when one considered the fact that the academy had a few million students, it just proved how rare mutants were in society. Your average citizen of the Empire could spend their entire life without ever coming across one. After hearing a bit of murmuring coming from his classmates, Eric took his seat. Clearly they were wondering why he was absent yesterday, and this morning. But it's not like he could tell them that he was banging a non-diplomat. If word ever got out about that, Eric was as good as dead. Thus, he let their imaginations run wild, as he waited for the instructor to enter the class. The professor wore a gray military uniform with red accents, and a black undershirt, with a matching tie. This was the standard dress uniform of the Imperial Navy, one which the man wore with pride as he entered the class with a cup of coffee in one hand and a cigarette in the other. With cancer being a disease which the Germanic Star Empire discovered a cure for long ago, practically every man smoked in the Empire to take the edge off of their daily lives. Unlike alcohol and other drugs, tobacco did not hinder one's performance in life, and was thus used heavily by soldiers who had seen the worst the galaxy had to offer. In fact, it was one of 2 drugs which were legally permitted for use in the Empire. And while tobacco was legal, even in the civilian sector, adrenal stimulants were only prescribed to soldiers in the field. After finishing the last drag on his cigarette, the instructor looked upon his newcomer and introduced himself with a wry smile on his rugged face. I see our absent cadet has finally decided to grace us with his presence. Believe me, I am already well aware of the circumstances that prevented you from attending my course yesterday. I have also been informed not to discuss the details of such a delicate matter, and thus I will keep my mouth shut. So the rest of you little mutants don't even bother asking me. For those of you, who are either just arriving, or did not pay attention yesterday, I will repeat myself just this once. I am Commander Vernuk Ekberg, a retired naval officer, and your instructor in galactic politics. It is my duty to inform each and every one of you, on which of the alien species are friendly towards our esteemed race, and which are hostile. As for everyone else, They have simply been categorized as to be determined, for in the eyes of the Empire, you are either an ally or an enemy. There is no such thing as neutrality. Now, before I start on today's lecture, who here can tell me about humanity? The class of mutants began to discuss amongst themselves the topic at hand, and upon seeing that nobody had the answer to such a simple question, Eric raised his hand, which was immediately called out by Colonel Ekberg. Ah yes, Mr. Yeager is it? Go ahead, enlighten me on what you know. Eric looked around at the eyes of all his classmates who were set upon him and gulped down the saliva that had been pooling in his mouth before answering the question to the best of his ability. Humanity, humans, or, if you want to be archaic, mankind, is the previous evolution of the Germanic race. It is the species which we evolved from on planet Earth, before the great exodus which led our ancestors to Germania. From my understanding, there were once several subspecies of humanity, all of which competed for land and resources in the old world. As our ancestors began to be overwhelmed by the inferior stock of the other subspecies who had outnumbered us quite significantly, we fled to the stars to escape the death of our race and culture. In doing so, we determined our own course of evolution, which has led our people to greatness. Meanwhile, humanity still endures in some form, albeit as a shadow of their former selves. Without our people to uplift the other subspecies, they used the warp drive that we invented to settle a handful of planets. During the last 4 centuries, the humans have failed to not only evolve biologically due to their misplaced hatred of eugenics and genetic alteration, but have barely managed to advance technologically. According to our most recent data on the so-called Confederation of Human Worlds, in the centuries since our departure, they have melded together into a single species, after centuries of the various subspecies interbreeding. One that is biologically inferior to the Germanic race in every aspect. For a second, Eric thought he saw a smile etch itself upon the grizzled veteran's rugged face. However, it appeared to have vanished just as quickly as it had occurred, leading Eric to believe that perhaps he was seeing things. After taking a long swig from his coffee, Colonel Ekberg nodded his head and applauded Eric's answer, which was straight out of the Empire's propaganda. After doing so, he added on to information about the Confederation of Human Worlds. Correct. Now, I suppose you must be wondering if we are superior to this archaic offshoot that cannot even be considered the same species as our esteemed race. Then you must be wondering why we have not reclaimed Earth by now. Surely we have the power to do so. Eric nodded his head in agreement with the instructor's statement. The answer to this question had eluded him for quite some time. After a brief pause, Colonel Ekberg activated a hologram, which displayed 4 unique-looking races. One of which Eric immediately recognized as the Light Elves who ruled over this quadrant of the galaxy. Upon seeing that his students were interested in the topic at hand, Colonel Ekberg pointed to the 4 races and began his lecture in galactic politics. If one wants to know the answer to this question, they must first understand galactic politics. These are the 4 major galactic powers in the Milky Way galaxy. Even the dumbest among our race knows who the Light Elves are, for which we are a vassal of their mighty empire. However, how many of you know what these other 3 races are? Even Eric, who was quite knowledgeable about most subjects, did not know the names of the other 4 major galactic powers, only that they wielded military and economic strength on par with the Alpheim Dominion. Apparently, neither did any of the other cadets, because they all scratched their heads like a bunch of fools. Seeing that nobody knew the answer to this question, Colonel Ekberg sighed heavily before continuing with his lecture. The Alpheim Dominion, the Azura Cabal, the Svartalfheim Federation, and the Entheocracy, these are the 4 major galactic players. All of which, as you may have guessed from their names, once visited Earth during the distant past. While the Alpheim Dominion rules over our quadrant of the galaxy, the Svartalfheim Federation, or the Dark Elves, rule over the territory where the Confederation of Human Planets lies. The 2 factions have been at odds since their 2 races split apart eons ago. After our rise to prominence, and the wars we have won on behalf of the Alpheim Dominion, the Dark Elves sought out a way to spite their rivals. And because they could not directly attack the Alpheim Dominion, due to the influence of the Gimdari Trade Union who act as a mediator between the 4 major galactic powers, the damned Dark Elves decided to spite us, the greatest weapon that the Light Elves have in their proxy wars. During their research into our history, the Dark Elves came across the fact that we are the descendants of Earth, and in doing so, declared the fledgling Confederation of Human Worlds under their protection. That is why we cannot invade the Confederation and reclaim our homeland. Now that is enough for today's lecture. Tomorrow, I will begin instruction about the scale on which interstellar civilizations are rated. I expect you all to remember this information for your upcoming exams. Shortly after saying this, the bell rang, freeing Eric up for the rest of his daily classes. Though the lecture was brief, he had learned a great deal about the greater galaxy, and the major players who controlled everything in the Milky Way. Much of this knowledge was not taught outside of the military academies, and thus, Eric had learned something quite valuable. Chapter 7, The Leaderboard. Because Eric had showed up late at the academy, he had missed half a day's worth of classes. Thus, he only had to attend a few more lectures before the time arrived to retire to the night. The Naval Academy on Germania was the largest and most prestigious of all naval academies within the Germanic Star Empire. The campus was practically the size of a city, and housed millions of young cadets, most of which were currently off-world visiting their wives for the summer. It was their duty to have as many children as possible, and because of this, contraceptives were mostly outlawed, with a few exceptions being made for specialized careers such as spies who infiltrated other interstellar civilizations. These spies were some of the few men permitted to engage in sexual relations with other species, but the requirement was that they would have to set their neural link to prohibit procreation during their encounters. Not that any of this applied to Eric, who just wanted to get something to eat for the night before retiring to the barracks. Thus, he activated the grid and looked for a good place to grab a bite, which he found not far from his current location. As Eric walked through the streets, he saw another holographic projection of the up-and-coming idol Erica Krieger, which displayed one of her recent performances. Though he had to admit, the woman was gorgeous even by Germanic standards, and was perhaps the most beautiful woman he had ever laid eyes upon. He couldn't help but sigh as he tried to ignore the sounds of the pop music, which he found to be nothing but irritating. Eventually, he made his way to a small diner, where a few other mutants like himself were sitting in a booth. He recognized all three of them from his galactic politics course. When Eric entered the facility, they immediately waved him over, and though he did not really want to associate with other mutants, he figured it would at the very least be polite to talk with them. After sitting down at the table, the group of three young men introduced themselves. "Hey, you're the new guy who was late to class, weren't you? I'm Frederick Anderson, and these two assholes are Dolph Van Dyne and Karlika Urson, so what the hell kept you away for so long? And why is it so hush-hush?" Eric did not dare tell these men that he had broken several laws the night before, whose combined punishment would surely be met with the death penalty, and instead he decided to be deliberately vague in his introduction. "My name is Eric Yeager, by the way. As for what kept me from arriving on time, I was held up by a foreign diplomat. I can't go too much into detail about why she kept me for so long as it is a personal matter, and she asked me not to tell anyone." There was a look of disappointment on all the guys' faces as they heard Eric's explanation. Frederick was a handsome young man with cyan hair and blood-red eyes, but aside from that, there were no other major mutations to speak of. In fact, the entire Germanic race was considered physically attractive by most humanoid races. And by the standards of 21st century humans, they were all the equivalent of supermodels, with the most attractive of the Germanic race being the on par with divine figures. Part of the genetic enhancement that every Germanic citizen went through during their birth altered their DNA to remove them from any imperfections. As a result, genes that resulted in unattractive traits like baldness, poor eyesight, ugliness, body hair, predisposure to weight gain, small breasts, small male genitalia, and any other number of physical flaws, had been entirely removed from the Germanic gene pool, and were instead replaced with the genes that were more desirable. In fact, 99.9% of the Germanic race fit into the mold of the perfectarian as envisioned by the National Socialist German Workers' Party, who were in many ways the ideological and spiritual predecessors of the Germanic Star Empire. Those who were mutated as a result of an error most commonly found in experimental high-grade gene serums like the one Eric was injected with, and were determined to be unfit for termination, were like the men sitting in this room, flawless in every way, except for a lack of what was considered by society to acceptable hair and eye color. Which, as far as the Germanic Star Empire was concerned, consisted of either blonde or red hair with blue eyes. Upon seeing the dejected expressions on his classmates' faces, Eric sighed and shrugged his shoulders, before typing in an order on the grid for what he desired to eat at this cafe. Within a few minutes, a robot came out and served the drink and meal of Eric's choice, which was a burger, fries, and a shake. While biting into his burger, Eric noticed something peculiar in the uniforms of the other cadets. Something which he did not yet have on his own. It was a small hexagon on the breast pocket with what appeared to be a digital image which displayed a unique number. For example, Dolph's rating was 3,257,982, while Carl's was much lower at 1,397,527 and Frederick's was at a whopping 12,957,335. If he thought back upon it, the young men who had bullied him on the transit also had numbers on their chests, which were much higher than Dolph and Carl's. Thus, Eric could not help but ask just what they represented. "By the way, what are those numbers on the breast pocket of your uniforms?" The three men exchanged glances with one another before explaining in detail just what the images represented. "That's right, you were late and missed your first day at the academy. The thought didn't even cross my mind that you didn't know about a leaderboard. Essentially, the number on our chest is our place on the leaderboard. Every student in the academy is ranked on it, and it changes in real time to reflect one's position. It takes into account all of your activities on campus. Whether it is your academic performance, or your capability in the simulators, or even your physical fitness levels. Since you missed your first day and a half, the eye probably hasn't registered you yet. By tomorrow morning, you will see your place in your uniform's breast pocket. This sparked a number of questions in Eric's mind, which he was quick to ask about. So what do I get for having a high score on the leaderboard? Dolph was quick to inform Eric about the benefits of having a high score on the leaderboard in an almost condescending tone. The higher your rank on the leaderboard, the more likely you are to get into a better specialty school. By now, you should already be aware that most cadets spend a full 4 years at the academy before going into specialized training for the role they were selected to serve in. However, based upon your performance at the academy, you can either get sent to a run-of-the-mill specialty school or an elite one. There is also a similar system at your specialty school, where based upon what percentile you graduate in will determine your rank and unit upon entering service. So, for example, say you graduate in the top 1% of all cadets here at the Naval Academy, and then go on to graduate at the top 1% in your elite specialty school. You are pretty much guaranteed to be given the rank of lieutenant, and depending on your specialization, you might have to go through additional training to become a Special Forces operative, where you will also be judged based upon performance. By the way, what is your specialty? Eric wore a bitter smile as he informed his new classmates of just what role the government had given him to serve in during his years in the military. I've been assigned to the role of a starfighter pilot. The 3 men grimaced when they heard the specialty that Eric was given, and looked at him as if they were in the presence of a dead man. This was something that Eric already expected to happen, and could only shake his head as he accepted his lot in life. However, Carl spoke up for perhaps the first time since Eric sat down, giving the silver-haired lad some solid advice. If I were you, I would do everything I can to score in the top 1% both here in the Naval Academy, and in your specialty school. We may be mutants, but we have a natural advantage over the rest of these fuckers. While they're out plowing their wives during the summer, we have to attend more courses, which not only gives us a head start, but allows us to graduate earlier. Use these next 2 years to climb your way to the top of the leaderboard, and if you do manage to graduate in the top 1% of both the academy and your elite flight school, you will get sent to Special Forces training, where if you graduate at the top of that, then you can join an elite squadron like Black Sun and perhaps even lead your own wing of fighters. Although those guys participate in the most dangerous spaceborne operations of the entire military, they have the highest survival rate, because they are given the best ships, and have the best training. They also tend to receive the best rewards. I can't confirm the validity about what I'm about to say, but I heard from a rather reliable source about a Black Sun pilot who was a mutant like us, but because of his achievements on the battlefield, the party permitted him to have a wife and children, albeit they closely monitored the genetic line of the guy to ensure that there were no further mutants being born. But still, that is something most of us mutants won't be able to obtain in our lives. I know I won't be able to. There is not much room for fancy medals or acts of heroism when you are destined to become an engineering officer. But my odds of surviving are significantly higher than yours. Even if we do get cloned after we die, that is not something I wish to experience. After all, there is a philosophical argument to be made. If you die, and your memories are transplanted into the body of a clone, are you really the same person? That's not a debate I want to have with myself. It is enough to give any man an existential crisis. Eric could not help but agree with everything Carl had said. From getting into an elite flight school, and becoming a Special Forces pilot, to not wanting to die and suffer an existential crisis when his memories were transplanted into a clone's body. Thus, in that moment, he decided that he would do everything in his power to reach the top of the leaderboard over the next 2 years of his life. After sharing a meal with several of his classmates, Eric returned to the barracks, where he entered the room he was given. Though the barracks were referred to by such a term, they were anything but what one might think of when first hearing the word. In fact, the rooms which the cadets were given, while utilitarian in design, like just about everything else in the Empire, were about the size of a studio apartment. The room had everything Eric needed to be comfortable over the next 2 years of his life, and thus, he was quite happy with his new home. After stripping out of his uniform and taking a shower, he climbed into bed, where he planned to get some shut-eye. That is, until he checked his messages on the grid, to see that his mother had attempted to call him over 100 times since he had first landed in Germania. Just when he was about to contact the woman, he saw that she was already calling him. With a deep breath, Eric prepared himself for the scolding of a lifetime as he accepted his mother's call. "Hey Mom!" Immediately, the woman interrupted her son, as she began to scream at him with all the strength she could muster. "Don't hey Mom me, young man. Do you have any idea how worried I was? It has been an entire day since you were supposed to land in Germania, and yet, Despite the fact that I told you to contact me every night before you went to bed, I have heard nothing from you, my own beloved son. I feared the worst. Perhaps your transport had gotten sucked into a black hole, or maybe you were kidnapped by your father's rivals. Speaking of your father, he seems to be in a pissy mood whenever I ask him about whether or not you are alright, but he won't tell me why. Don't tell me you are already causing trouble there in the capital? Just what on earth have you been up to? Question mark. Eric was at a loss for words. It had not even been 24 hours since he first left for the capital of the empire, and already so many things had happened to him. First, he had committed a capital offense by hooking up with a representative of the Great Ana Empire, and then he had been bullied on the transit before getting a fellow cadet expelled. Finally, he had gone through half a day's classes, and just now learned about the complex system for which all cadets were judged by, one that would determine his future prospects during his tenure in the military. There were too many things on his mind for him to even come up with a proper response to his mother's scolding. For which he could only apologize. I'm sorry, Mother, truly I am. I should have contacted you when I first landed. I won't make excuses. It's just that I got tied up in a complex matter with a diplomat from a foreign empire, and as a result, my last 24 hours have been pretty hectic. I actually planned to get some shut-eye when you called me. Can we talk about this tomorrow after I have rested for a bit? Though Krista was furious about her son's behavior, she could see that he was exhausted, and thus sighed heavily before agreeing to continue her scolding on the following day. Alright, get some sleep, and remember to contact me tomorrow, or I will be even more furious. Eric smiled and nodded his head, before hanging up on his mother, but not before leaving some parting words. Of course, I love you, Mom. After saying this, he hung up the phone, and fell to sleep, while thinking about Yumi's naked body. Chapter 8, The Various Levels of Interstellar Civilization on the Other Side of the Planet. A man who appeared middle-aged sat within a large office. The room was surrounded on all sides by windows which displayed the giant city that was an entire world, and the busy happenings of its citizens. The man in question had short gray hair and a few wrinkles, which showed off only the slightest amount of age. And while the man appeared as if he were in his late 40s, he was in reality 300 years old, and was none other than the second supreme leader of the Germanic Star Empire. Hans Zapp sat in his office chair, as he gazed upon the holographic projection of what appeared to be a young man no older than 20 dressed in his military uniform. This man had distressed expression on his face as he bowed his head in submission, before apologizing profusely for his son's scandalous actions. Please, Supreme Leader, forgive my son. He is a young, and foolhardy. I doubt he could resist the temptation of that Ana temptress. You know better than I do about her skills in the art of seduction. A young boy has no chance against such a voracious tigress. A slight scoff escaped from the Supreme Leader's lips as he spoke about the potential punishment for the crime of miscegenation, which was among the most heinous crimes one could commit in the Germanic Star Empire. Your son is already an adult, and he has committed a disgusting and heinous act by sleeping with a foreigner. He did not even command his neural link to temporarily sterilize himself for the duration of his sinful deed. What if a half-breed is born of this unholy union? Would you then have him take responsibility for his actions? The only reason your son's head is still attached to his neck is because the foreigner he slept with just so happens to be the aunt of the Ana Emperor. If not for her pulling some strings with her nephew, demanding that the boy be spared of his rightful punishment, then I would have had him executed on the spot. But my hands are tied. The Ana are a valuable ally, one which I cannot afford to offend with a matter as petty as this. Discipline your son on my behalf and ensure that he does not make such an error again. Before Heinrich could even thank the Supreme Leader for his benevolence, the line was cut, where Hans sat in his office with a frown on his face, as he voiced his disgust at Eric's actions. Fucking mutants. They have no respect for our way of life. I don't know why we even spare any of them. Entirely unaware of the quite literal bullet he had just dodged, Eric slept through the night with a peaceful expression on his face. When he awoke in the morning, it was at the crack of dawn. An audio recording of a bugle resounded across his room, thus waking him from his sweet dreams. Without a second thought, he climbed into the shower and got himself dressed for physical training. Upon adorning his t-shirt over his chiseled body and looking in the mirror, Eric noticed something peculiar. The hexagon on his shirt had a number digitally displayed, one which shocked the young man to the core of his being. From only half a day of school, Eric's rank on the leaderboards was already at 1,250,000. Evidently he had perfect scores on all of his first assignments, which bumped him up well into the top 5% of the 25 million students which attended the Naval Academy on Germania. Even though the Empire's population was in the trillions, few men were selected for officer roles in the military. Most were enlisted personnel. And while the Naval Academy on Germania was the largest of the naval academies in the Empire, there was one on every habited planet. Meaning there were 100 naval academies in total. Still, to be within the top 5% of cadets after a single day of classes, this was quite an accomplishment. Even then, it just meant his life would be even more difficult if he wanted to reach the top 1% or even the top spot. Thus, Eric resigned himself to pushing himself past his limits during the physical training which he was about to endure. PT was no joke. Even though many of these men would not go into the Star Marines, the minimally accepted PT score was set to the minimum of the elite infantry unit standards. To receive a perfect score, one had to be in astounding shape. Luckily, Eric had been injected with an experimental grade S gene serum when he was in his mother's womb, and thus, he scored higher than most Germanic men in nearly all attributes. However, this was not something that was unique to Eric. Millions of fetuses each year were injected with an experimental grade S serum, and only a small portion of them were ever mutated. If he had to guess, then the top 5% of cadets attending the Naval Academy on Germania had been given the same serum as him. No, considering the Academy on Germania was the most prestigious school, this meant that it was likely that 10% if not more of the students had received a grade S serum. Meaning he would have to rely on more than just his genetic gifts to reach the top 1% of all cadets. Thus, he pushed himself beyond the limits he thought he had, and by the end of the class, he saw that his rank had increased ever so slightly on the leaderboard. After training for 2 whole hours, the cadets entered the showers, where they washed off the sweat and grime from their bodies before attending their courses. Everything from advanced mathematics, physics, chemistry, and any number of basic courses, to more specialized lectures like strategy, tactics, and survival, everything required to become an exemplary military officer as well as a productive member of the civilian sector was provided by the academy. Just after lunch, Eric found himself back in galactic politics, where his teacher, Colonel Vernuk Ekberg, had fulfilled his promise to teach Eric and the others about the classifications of civilizations. The room was practically an amphitheater, even if it was mostly empty, and it had windows on all sides, which displayed the city below. If one got distracted, they could easily watch the citizens of Germania go about their daily lives for the entire lecture. In the center of the room stood the instructor, who activated a large holographic projection, which displayed the information he was talking about. With a cigarette in one hand, and a mug of coffee in the other, he spoke about the classifications of interstellar civilizations. By now you should all be aware of this material, but since it is only the 3rd day of your first semester, I decided that I will give you all a brief review. Now, who here can tell me what classification the Empire has on the galactic scale of civilizations? Eric raised his hand. The more questions he answered correctly in class, the more his score would raise, and thus he was quick to raise his hand before all others. Seeing that the new arrival was so eager to participate, the colonel smiled before choosing him. All right, Silver, go ahead. With a proud smile on his face, Eric displayed the knowledge which was quite common in the Germanic Star Empire. Our empire is considered a Tier 1 regional power. Vernuk smiled and nodded his head as he took a drag from his cigarette before posing another question to Eric. Correct, but can you tell me what that means? This was a far more difficult question, but Eric was just as prepared to answer it as he responded with a confident smirk on his face. An interstellar civilization is judged upon several factors, including but not limited to the number of systems in its territory, the number of worlds colonized, their military strength, their economic prowess, and their technological development. The Germanic Star Empire ranks at the bottom tier of the regional power classification, specifically because of the minuscule size of our empire. We only have 36 systems, and 100 colonized worlds. This is dwarfed by even the smallest of minor powers, let alone those in a similar ranking such as the Great Hunna Empire, which has over 10,000 star systems under its control. However, while our empire is relatively small when compared to our peers, we have supreme military and economic strength, as well as advanced technology. If we had as many star systems as the Great Hunna Empire under our control, then we would likely be either a Tier 3 regional power, or perhaps even a Tier 1 subgalactic power. Which is one of the reasons why the Alphaim Dominion has decided to vassalize our great race. Vernuk smiled and nodded his head, as he confirmed what Eric said to be accurate, before adding more information about the classification system which the galaxy used to determine the rankings of different civilizations. You are once more correct in your assessment. There are 4 major classifications for an interstellar civilization, and for each category, there are also 3 tiers. On the bottom of the scale, we have the minor powers, which are civilizations with anywhere between 100 and 1,000 star systems and planets under their control. The fact that we are ranked a regional power, without even meeting one of the minimum requirements to be considered a minor power, is a testament to the strength, intelligence, and ingenuity of our great race. I won't go into too much detail about the various capabilities of each classification since it is a relative scale, but for the sake of review just know that minor powers are vastly inferior to our civilization in practically every way, aside from the number of star systems they own, and how many worlds they have colonized. They also tend to be vassalized by regional powers. One thing that needs to be noted before I move on to the regional powers is that interstellar civilizations like the Confederation of Human Worlds are so insignificant on the galactic stage that they do not even qualify as a minor power. Okay, moving on now. The next group we are looking at would be regional powers, which is what we are classified as. Most regional powers have a between 1 and 100,000 star system under their control, either directly or through vassalization. Technologically, militarily, and economically, the overwhelming majority of regional powers are inferior to the Germanic Star Empire, with at most Tier 3 regional powers being able to compete with our military might. Regional powers also tend to be vassalized by subgalactic powers. After the regional powers, are the subgalactic powers. These are the second rarest level of interstellar civilization. They are extraordinarily powerful and hold large swaths of the galaxy within their sphere of influence. Nearly all vassals of a major galactic power are of this classification. However, we are the exception to this rule. Finally, there are the galactic powers, which there are technically 6 of, but only 4 of them are considered the major galactic powers. As previously discussed, the Alphaean Dominion, the Svartalphaean Federation, the Azure Cabal, and the En Theocracy are all galactic powers, and these 4 powers combined are in control of the entire galaxy either directly or through a series of vassalizations. However, there are 2 other galactic powers, which you need to be aware of. There is the Gindari Trade Union, a race of goblinoids, who control the galactic economy. Unlike the other galactic powers, they have less territory than even our empire. However, their military strength is formidable, despite their more pacifistic nature, and, as I previously stated, the galactic economy is almost entirely under their control. It is because of this fact that the Gindari Trade Union often acts as the mediator between the 4 major galactic powers, using their economic influence to compel more powerful nations than their own to do their bidding. Truly despicable. For most, it is considered a sign of prosperity and prestige to host a Gindari bank within their empire. But our civilization will never hand over the reins of our economy to any foreign nation, even if they came to our doorstep demanding that we do so. Finally, there is the Naraku, who has no home world to speak of, not that we know of at least, and live entirely in massive hive fleets. The Naraku are classified as a devouring swarm and are the most powerful of such species. They are hostile to all other civilizations and are powerful enough to contend with the 4 major galactic powers entirely on their own. It is a miracle they have not consumed all life in the galaxy already. Oh, look at the time. Well, this concludes our lecture for the day. Tomorrow we will begin a more in-depth study of galactic politics, so I hope you are well prepared. Have a good rest of your day, gentlemen. With this said, the bell rang, and Eric had departed from the lecture, thinking about how much of a testament it was that their race had progressed to a regional power in less than half a millennium after reaching the Interstellar Age. Chapter 9, Entering the Simulation. 2 weeks had passed since Eric first began attending the Naval Academy on Germania. By now he had gotten used to the cadet life. It was hardly different from the youth corps he was forced to attend as a child. However, even though it had already been 2 weeks into the semester, Eric and his fellow mutants had yet to be permitted to take part in what was arguably the most exciting aspect of life at the academy. That was until today. Currently, Eric stood inside a large and empty room that was practically a warehouse of considerable size. He was dressed in a flight suit, and looked around, waiting for the arrival of his fellow cadets and their instructor. However, just when he was about to leave the room, which he was given the coordinates to in advance, his surroundings suddenly shifted before his very eyes. What was previously an empty warehouse was now a flight hangar, filled with people and starfighters. Immediately, a smile lit up on Eric's face as he realized what had just happened. This was the holodeck, a building used to simulate combat environments for the cadets. And while Eric would not lay hands on an actual starfighter until after he graduated from the academy and entered flight school, he would still be required to learn the basics of flight inside the simulation which he now stood in. It was at this moment that Eric realized he was in line with a bunch of other pilots, who he did not recognize. The flight suits they wore were the same as his own. It was a stone gray in color and had the flag of the Germanic Star Empire on the right biceps, which was a red background, with a black sun in the center. Aside from a life support system built into the suit, there was also a helmet in his hands that had a large transparent face shield. At the moment, a wing commander was speaking to him, and the other pilots which stood by his side, all of which were part of the simulation. Men of Germania, a Nakaru hive fleet is no less than 20 light-years away from our borders. I won't lie to you. Many of you will die today, but you will die for the glory of the Empire, and the lives of its citizens. So go out there and squash those fucking bugs. The scenario which had been inserted into the simulation was one where the Empire was under a full-scale invasion by a galactic power. This was how the Empire trained its combatants, to experience the horrors of total warfare from the very start of their life as cadets. It was a no-win scenario, One designed explicitly to bring the best out of cadets, by squeezing every bit of potential for a possible victory. Because everything in the holodeck was realistic even to the touch, if Eric was shot down in the simulation, he would understand the pain of death, even if he would not actually die from the experience. Thus, he was sweating bullets, as he realized he would effectively be sent into battle, without the slightest idea in how to fly the spacecraft. Before Eric could even figure out what was going on, one of the simulated pilots behind him pushed him towards his starfighter. Without even thinking, Eric climbed into the cockpit and attached his helmet onto the neckline of his flight suit, sealing off any air from escaping, and thus pressurizing his body for the vacuum of space. Just as Eric was about to call out to the eye to suspend the scenario, he found that a tutorial screen projected itself into his vision via the HUD display that automatically downloaded itself onto his neural link. Immediately, a synthesized voice entered his ears as the eye, which was designed to assist him in flight, began to speak to him. "My name is EVA, which stands for Enhanced Virtual Assistant. I will be your flight instructor today. The scenario you are about to experience has been set on recruit level difficulty after taking into account that this is your first time flying. Like in real life, you only have one life, so I suggest you complete the scenario with survival in mind. For the record, if you die in the simulation, it will affect your score on the leaderboard. Good luck, and remember to follow my advice at all times." EVA's voice continued to speak to Eric as the artificial intelligence helped the young cadet navigate the controls of the starship. The starfighter which he was given in this scenario was the most commonly deployed design, known by the nickname of the Dagger. The starfighter was designed to be capable of contending with starships above its own weight class, so to speak. It was a fast and nimble fighter, with serious firepower on board. Not only did the Dagger have a total of 3 laser repeaters attached to it, but it also made use of a plasma cannon and was outfitted with 12 antimatter missiles. Despite the fact that the Dagger was a fast and powerful starfighter, its defenses were severely lacking when compared to other starfighters employed by the Empire, and its foes. In other words, it was a glass cannon. This was one of the reasons why so many starfighter pilots lost their lives in the line of duty. However, when deployed in massive numbers, the Dagger was a serious problem for the enemies of the Empire, and it was one of the reasons why, despite its lacking defenses, it was considered the primary starfighter in use by the Germanic Star Empire. After getting a feel for the controls, Eric launched his ship out of the carrier and entered into the simulated space, where he and his fighter wing of simulated pilots were flying headfirst into a devouring swarm, which would not hesitate to rip them out of their spacecraft and eat them alive. Eric could not believe his eyes when he first witnessed the Naraka Hive fleet in person. Its ships were living biomechanical engines of destruction that were practically the size of entire planets. And the fighters which they deployed were living beings, specifically bred to survive in the vacuum of space. When compared to the fleet of Imperial warships, it was as if they were ants fighting against titanic monstrosities. For the first time in his life, Eric felt a true sense of fear overcome his heart as he gripped onto the joystick of his aircraft, perhaps a little too fiercely. What kind of horrific monsters were these? And what civilization could possibly contend with such reckless evil? These were just a few of the thoughts that flooded Eric's mind as he heard the eye speak to him once more. Hostile targets directly in front, approximately 13,000 kilometers ahead. Prepare for combat, and good luck. For a split second, Eric thought he could hear a sense of pity in the otherwise robotic voice of the artificial intelligence which assisted him in flight. Staring down at what was most certainly the personification of death, Eric gulped down the saliva which was pooling in his throat, and activated his missiles, as the HUD display connected to his neural link locked onto the target nearest to him. Immediately upon entering the combat zone, the Naraku drone began to spit a corrosive acid at their Imperial adversaries, as if they were Gatling guns. And while the simulated pilots of Eric's wing nimbly dodged the attacks, Eric's fighter had taken a direct hit on its left wing. No doubt due to his inexperience in piloting the spacecraft. The acid easily ate through the energy shields, draining the power of the starfighter as Eric struggled to gain a lock onto his target. As if playing a game of chicken, Eric and the Naraku sickle continued to barrel towards one another, until finally Eric was able to get off a shot. The antimatter missile fired off and quickly followed after the Naraku drone, which tried to dodge out of the way. However, the missile continued to track the beast until it finally collided with its target and blew it to smithereens. With the enemy destroyed, Eric felt an immediate sense of joy as he turned his fighter around to regroup with the rest of the wing. Still, his spacecraft's shields continued to deplete at a rapid rate because the acidic compound that had hit his fighter's left wing continued to eat away at the shield. Fearing he would lose all power to his shields in the first exchange, Eric made a single thought within his mind. And before he knew it, the energy which supplied his shields rapidly transitioned from the right side of the starfighter to the left wing to prevent the acid from eating entirely through the shields. While Eric struggled to fight off the acid which was eating away at his shields, Two men were watching his first attempt at the simulation with a curious expression on their faces. The lieutenant in charge of the holodeck exclaimed aloud, as his superior watched by his side. Just how did he manage to transfer the energy of his shields to the left wing? That is not a feature of the dagger. The admiral, who was watching the scenario unfold with interest in his eyes, scoffed, before lecturing the lowly lieutenant about Eric's special abilities. There's a reason this young man was selected to be a starfighter pilot. He has 3 exceptional abilities, 2 of which he inherited from his parents, and 1 which he gained from the Grey Death serum he was injected with at birth. Out of his 3 abilities, 1 island quite common, the other is exceptionally rare, while the third is exclusive only to him. In fact, its existence is entirely classified, and thus I can't tell you anything about it. What I can share with you is that this young man is capable of both communicating with others via his mind, while at the same time being able to control machines with his thoughts. With these 2 abilities alone, he has the potential to become one of the best starfighter aces of this generation. The lieutenant, who was in charge of running the simulations for the Academy's cadets, was stunned into silence for several moments before he asked for confirmation of what he believed to have been a misunderstanding on his part. "You're telling me this mutant is triple enhanced?" The admiral did not say a word, and just silently nodded his head, leaving the officer in complete and total shock. While every Germanic citizen was a genetically enhanced superhuman in terms of physical and mental capabilities, only a fraction of the population had special abilities, such as telepathy. These traits were usually unlocked via the Grey Death gene serum, which only a minority of the population was privileged enough to receive, and there was a very low chance of that happening. However, because of this, these special abilities could be passed down to offspring, and yet this was even rarer. Eric had not only inherited 1 ability from his father, and another from his mother, but he had even unlocked a 3rd ability from the Grey Death serum he had taken. One which, as far as the Empire was concerned, exclusively belonged to him. This meant that Eric was what many commonly referred to as triple enhanced. In the entirety of the Empire, whose populations was in the trillions, there were maybe 1 million men and women who could claim the same, and they usually went on to accomplish extraordinary things in their lives. Unfortunately, Eric did not live up to the hype. Even using 2 of his 3 abilities to navigate the scenario, it was still too much for him to handle. After defeating only 3 hostile drones, he was finally torn apart by his 4th target. Eric could feel the razor-sharp teeth of the biomechanical life form tear through his fighter's cockpit and the flesh of his body, as he found himself lying on the floor of an empty warehouse while crying out in pain. For a second, he thought he had genuinely lost his life. It took several moments for Eric to collect his thoughts, where he immediately took a look at his Neuralink to see that his place on the leaderboard had fallen by over 100 places. With an intense look of depression on his otherwise handsome face, he sighed heavily, before determining that he would need to spend as much time as possible in the simulations. After all, simulation scores were the #1 way to rise through the rankings of the leaderboard. With this, Eric had not only gotten his first taste of the holodeck, but also of what it was like to die in battle for the Empire. He was beginning to understand why so many men of the Empire did not fear death, because many of them had experienced it 1,000,000 times before ever stepping foot on the battlefield. Chapter 10, going viral. Before Eric knew it, 3 months had come and gone, and the summer had turned to autumn. He had successfully completed his first semester in the Naval Academy, and during this time he had spent nearly every waking hour either doing his classwork, or spending time in the holodeck, gaining valuable experience both as a starfighter pilot, and as a naval officer. What little time he had outside of classes and simulations he spent with his fellow cadets, Frederick, Carl, and Dolph. All of which seemed far less committed to rising through the ranks of the leaderboard than he was. However, the good times of being free to pursue his own education without fear of unnecessary harassment had suddenly come to an end, as an influx of students piled into the academy, which until now had seemed practically abandoned. It was no longer just mutants, staff, and a few delinquents trying to make up for failed courses. Instead, those who had spent the summer holiday away from the campus, and in the arms of their wives, were now back at the academy, and because of this, Eric was forced to sit through a day of orientation for the new class, who were woefully behind him and the other mutants. In fact, Eric could only look at the wide-eyed young men, who had just started their life as a cadet with pity in his silver eyes, because they would soon be experiencing the pain of death, something that he still found haunting every time he perished in the simulations. Since women were not permitted to partake in the military, the entire academy was filled with men. Something which seemed much more depressing now that the campus was no longer sparsely populated. Thus, while dressed in his cadet uniform, Eric sat in a large stadium, which had been prepared for the opening ceremony of the new class. As a man who now ranked in the top 3% of all students at the Naval Academy on Germania, Eric was not sitting in the nosebleeds like his friends, but rather he was front and center, as the admiral in charge of the university welcomed the new students to their new lives as cadets. "I look upon all of you, the young men of our great race, who will now begin their years of military service as cadets at this most prestigious academy, and I think to myself, the future of our empire is secure. Here, in the Naval Academy on Germania, you will all gain the experience you need to fulfill your duties as officers in the Imperial Navy. Some of you will be destined for more relaxed roles, while others will be using your gifts to bring the fight directly to our people's enemies. Regardless, most of you will be spending the next 4 years of your life here on campus, and because of that, I welcome you to your new home. Today, you can all relax, and become acquainted with your new lives as cadets, because tomorrow the real training begins. After the Admiral left the stage, a few other important personnel began making announcements, which Eric tuned out of, simply because he was already familiar with all the rules and regulations of the academy, having already completed a semester over the summer. Once the opening ceremony was completed, he and the rest of the freshman class were permitted to go about the massive campus that was the Naval Academy. Immediately after walking out of the building, Eric experienced something which he had nearly forgotten existed within the Empire. Discrimination against mutants. He found his friends, Frederick, Carl, and Dolph, surrounded by a group of new freshmen, who were trying to extort them out of their monthly stipends. Something which Eric had already dealt with during his senior year of high school. However, Eric was different now. He was no longer willing to tolerate being bullied for the color of his hair and eyes, nor run away from those who sought to cause him trouble. He had endured 3,572 death-like experiences since he had first started using the holodeck, each more painful than the last. Because of this, the last thing he feared in this life was something as petty as physical pain. Thus, while Frederick, Carl, and Dolph were encircled by a group of bullies, Eric broke through the crowd which was watching the event unfold, and placed a hand on the shoulder of the largest man in the group. No doubt this man had selected to become an officer in the Star Marines, much like the one who had gotten expelled on his first day of school for a similar infraction. As the young man looked over his shoulder to see just who had dared to touch him without his consent, Eric slammed his fist into the man's jaw, knocking him flat on his ass. The other bullies who had gathered around the mutants and were hurling obscenities stared in awe as their leader collapsed to the floor like a bag of bricks. Seeing that he had completely knocked out a future Star Marine with one punch, Eric glared at the other bullies with his silver eyes before giving them a single warning. You little shits. You think just because you have the pleasure of having normal colored hair and eyes that you can bully your superiors? I hate to break it to you, but you are in the military now, and we outrank you. The only thing that matters here in the Navy is one's ability to perform the tasks they are given. Your bullshit will not be tolerated any longer, so I suggest you readjust your behavior before you get flatlined like this asshole. I deduct 1,000 points from each of you, and 10,000 from this prick, since he is clearly the ringleader of your little entourage. Now get the fuck out of here before I decide you are in need of greater punishment. What Eric had said was correct. After spending an entire 3 months in the academy, proving his leadership abilities, Eric was now what was considered a cadet lieutenant, which meant he had the ability to discipline those cadets who were lower in rank than him. This was apparent by the insignia on his uniform, which differed from those around him. Even if Eric had just sucker punched a new cadet, he could simply chalk it up as corporal punishment for any number of behavioral infractions. This was a luxury that the cadets who bullied Eric on his first day of life as a cadet were not protected by, considering that they had not reached the rank of cadet ensign, which was the minimal rank required to begin dishing out punishments to other cadets of lower standing. The fact that this attack was caught on film by the crowd which had gathered around to laugh at the bullying did not matter in the slightest to Eric. If anything, it acted as evidence to support his claims of behavioral infractions. When he turned around to see the crowd staring in disbelief, his mood turned even more sour, as he screamed at all of them, in a voice that was filled with so much authority, one might forget that Eric was wearing the uniform of a cadet, and not an active duty officer of the Navy. What are you fuckers looking at? I suggest you stop wasting your time, and get started on your studies. Dismissed. Having seen this cadet lieutenant, who was only slightly taller than the average man, absolutely flatline a man significantly bigger than him, nobody wanted to get on Eric's bad side, and followed his orders as if they were law. Which technically speaking, they were. Once the area was only populated by Eric and his friends, they all sighed in relief before congratulating Eric on properly weaponizing his authority. Carl, in particular, was the first to speak out, as he voiced his disbelief at what he had just witnessed. Goddamn, if I knew I would have the ability to dish out punishment like that to a bunch of assholes, I would have worked harder. I seriously just wasted my biggest advantage over these chuckle fucks. A friendly smile emerged on Eric's face as he immediately insulted Carl with friendly banter. I kept telling you guys that you needed to focus more on your studies. This is why the system here in the academy gives some pretty sweet perks to guys who not only rise in the leaderboards but also in rank as well. You only have yourself to blame for being so lazy. Out of the 4 friends, Only Eric had made it to a cadet officer rank, and because of this, the rest of the guys would have to rely on him, if in the future they ever encountered another situation like the one they were just forced to endure. Thus, Eric and his friends decided to grab some lunch before they parted ways for the day. After eating with his friends, Eric would spend the rest of his free time participating in the holodeck, where he would attempt to raise his rank in the academy, and on the leaderboard even higher than it already was. Little did Eric know it, but the video of him knocking out a future star Marine made it onto the grid and immediately went viral. In one of the other core worlds of the Empire, a rising starlet was looking at the grid via her neural link and scoffed in disdain at what she saw. Fucking mutants. I can't believe he is able to get away with such a heinous act. The military must be desperate to put a freak like that in any position of power. With this in mind, Erica immediately made a comment on the video, which would only cause it to become even more viral, as she spoke about how mutants are a blight on society, and that they shouldn't be permitted to live, even in the forms that were currently considered acceptable by the party. A sentiment that within mere seconds gained billions of likes from all over the Empire. Seeing that she had thoroughly painted a target on the back of whoever this silver-haired cur was, Erica smiled with satisfaction until hearing her manager's voice on the other side of her changing room door. Erica, you have an interview in 5 minutes. Are you almost done changing? The pink-haired idol had completely forgotten about her work, during her brief break, and immediately scrambled to finish changing before bolting out the door with a pretty smile on her stunning face. When her manager saw her, he immediately smiled and complimented the teenage girl on her flawless appearance. As always, you are the physical incarnation of the ancient goddess Freya. Now, hurry up, the hostess of the lunch hour isn't going to wait for much longer. With this said, Erica was dragged onto yet another stage, where she sat down and shook hands with a woman who was significantly older than herself. The cameras had focused their attention on the young starlet, and the audience applauded her appearance with almost religious fervor before slowly calming down and allowing the hostess to speak. Erica, it is good to have you on the show. I can't help but express how big of a fan I am of your work. Erica made a pretty smile as she thanked the woman for her kind words before returning the compliment with one of her own. Thanks. That means a lot coming from you. I must admit that I am also a huge fan of yours, Mrs. Carlson. The audience applauded Erica's exceptional manners as the teenage idol waved to them and the cameras while blowing kisses. An act which had trillions of men from across the Empire gluing their eyes to the broadcast. However, in the next moment, the hostess sidelined Erica with a curveball of a question. So Erica, I have to ask, you are considered by many to be the Empire's sweetheart, and yet just a few minutes ago, you left a particularly vicious remark about those more commonly referred to by society as mutants. On a video, I might add, that showed a young cadet officer who just so happened to be a mutant, disciplining some new cadets for multiple behavioral infractions. What caused you to respond in such a way? Both Erica and her manager were looking at the hostess with dumbfounded expressions. This was not in the script which they had been given when they agreed to take the interview, and thus Erica, in particular, was at a loss for words as she began to fumble around in her mind for a proper response. After taking a deep breath, she decided to use this moment to engage in a particularly hateful speech against a class of people who could technically be considered disenfranchised by society. Well, I'm clearly not the only one who thinks this way. Within minutes, I had billions of likes from across the Empire. By now it is likely in the trillions. Let's be honest here. Does anyone actually think it is wise to allow these clear genetic defects to continue making a mockery of our great race? While most of these freaks are rightfully euthanized at birth, the party has, for whatever reason, determined that a few of these mongrels are unfit for termination. If they were to just live their lives as pawns in our society, to make the rest of our lives easier, I would be fine with that. However, this young man in the video is clearly living a life of enormous privilege. He has not only been accepted into the most prestigious naval academy that our empire has to offer, but has even been given a position of power over normal cadets. It is truly sickening. I can only say that I am happy that these burdens on our society are not allowed to reproduce, because if they were, our entire lineage as a race would be under threat. Contrary to what the host was expecting, not only did the audience cheer and applaud the young woman for her boldness, but even the comments of the livestream were filled with support for Erica, and in a way, her popularity had just jumped to new heights, at the expense of Eric's well-being. Seeing that her trap had only further added to the rising star's popularity, the hostess immediately switched back to the script. But the damage had already been done, and as a result of Erica's hateful words, Eric would now have a monumental target on his back, as the teenage idol's massive fan base would deliberately target him for harassment in the future. Chapter 11, Concerns of the Alphaim Dominion. While Eric was dealing with the aftermath of Erica's interview, and the heat that he would receive as a result of it, there were far more important events occurring across the galaxy. Though the propaganda machine of the Germanic Star Empire tried to downplay the fact that a Naraka hive fleet was rapidly approaching their territory, the supreme leader was far from calm about this occurrence. And he was not alone in this regard. On the home world of the Alpheim Dominion, within the tallest spire of its largest city, sat the Empress of the Light Elves, who had a completely stoic expression on her otherwise beautiful face. Though this otherworldly beauty appeared as if nothing in this universe could possibly cause a moment of genuine emotion to appear on her icy face, her heart was beating quite rapidly. While her youngest daughter reported information about one of their more powerful vassal states being annihilated by the Naraka hive fleet. It would appear that the Rylonian Imperium has been completely annihilated, their fleets have been reduced to debris scattered about their stars, while their worlds have been scoured of all life from the relentless onslaught of the devouring swarm. What remains of their race have fled their borders, and are seeking asylum in the nearest civilizations. Mother, the loss of a Tier 3 subgalactic power is a tragedy which affects our entire standing on the galactic stage. If the other powers were to learn of this, they would begin pressing us on our borders. While the Fifth Fleet is currently being dispatched to deal with the bugs, I fear the damage has already been done. Despite the grim news, Empress Lunaria Asterion did not react in the slightest. Instead, she posed a question which baffled her youngest daughter, in a voice that was both soft and angelic while still retaining the dignity and authority of a galactic empress. Celestia, if my calculations are correct, then it will only be a few years before the Naraka hive fleet, which the Admiralty has designated by the name Terminus, arrives at the borders of the Germanic Star Empire. Is that correct? Celestia, like her mother, was perhaps one of the most, if not the most beautiful woman in the galaxy. At least by humanoid standards. Like all light elves, her skin was so pale that it was nearly glowing, while her ears were long and pointy, like the rest of her race. The woman's eyes were as gold as the sun, which the earth revolved around, while her hair was as white as snow. Her body, while somewhat tall by the standards of baseline humans, was slender but soft in all the right places. Like the rest of her species, her breasts were rather small, but that did not prevent her from having a perfect hourglass figure. Despite having a face that appeared to have been crafted by a cosmic entity who was hell-bent on creating the perfect woman, Celestia was currently scowling, and yet it did not taint her features. Why was she scowling? Because even at a moment as dire as this, her mother was still obsessed with the Germanic Star Empire, which was a minuscule interstellar civilization on the fringes of their territory. Believing perhaps her mother had not understood the urgency of which she reported, Celestia began to raise her voice to her esteemed mother, who is one of the most powerful beings in the entire galaxy. Mother, did you not hear me? The Rylonians have virtually gone extinct. There is a rampaging hive fleet in our territory, and our vessels have begun to doubt our ability to protect them. If that were not bad enough, our rivals on the galactic stage will soon take advantage of this chaos to press our borders. What does a Tier I regional power like the Germanic Star Empire have to do with any of this? For the first time in over 1,000 years, Celestia had witnessed a hint of emotion appear on her mother's stoic face. The celestial beauty's brows furrowed ever so slightly as her voice raised in agitation. Celestia Asterion. You dare to raise your voice to your mother and Empress. If you were not my daughter, I would have your atoms scattered for speaking to me in such a way. Immediately, Celestia felt shivers go down her spine. She had never seen her mother so outraged, and the fact that it was because she questioned the woman's clear obsession with a minor race only further added salt to injury. Just when Celestia was about to speak up again, her mother switched the subject. The Centennial War Games will be upon us in only 5 years. The last time they occurred 100 years ago, the Germanic Star Empire surprised us all. A civilization that did not even meet all the minimum requirements to be considered a minor power had so thoroughly trounced many of the more exceptional regional powers in our quadrant, and they have only become more powerful since then. It is a pity that they do not yet have the resources to deal with the Naraka hive fleet by themselves, because I dare say that I am tempted to send my favorite attack hound to deal with these pesky bugs. Although, if our Fifth Fleet fails to defeat the hive fleet Terminus, then ultimately the GSC will be forced to fight them, anyway. I wonder how they will surprise me then. Celestia could see a look of excitement flicker in her mother's eyes as she spoke about the recent upstart that had clearly stolen her attention for these past few centuries. For a race that was biologically immortal like the Light Elves, a few hundred years were comparable to a few days. For the life of her, Celestia could not understand her mother's borderline infatuation with such a young race, who had only recently entered the Interstellar Age, and thus she was forced to ask. Mother, I just don't understand what your obsession with the Germanic people is. Sure, they have developed quite rapidly, but there are other civilizations in our quadrant that develop at an even greater speed. So why do you favor them so much? Is it because of their looks? I will admit that they are attractive, perhaps more so than most, but we have other races as our vassals who are superior in that regard as well. Please, Mother, Explain to me what compels you to look at them with such excited eyes. Lunaria looked at her daughter with a look of pity, as if she were gazing upon a young child who knew nothing of the greater universe. She sighed heavily, while internally debating whether or not she should tell her daughter the whole truth, or just part of it. After several moments of internal discord, the Empress of the Light Elves finally spoke about some of the thoughts that were flooding her ancient mind. Celestia, you know how old I am. For as long as I have lived and watched over our family's empire, I have never encountered anything remotely similar to the Germanic people. If logic applied to their species, then they should have been extinct the moment they fired upon the Veltarians nearly 400 years ago. And yet, despite only recently settling their new homeworld, and having technology far below that of a Tier I minor power, the Germanic Star Empire defeated a Tier III minor power, in the conflict they refer to as the First Contact War. They did not do this by virtue of their military strength, but because of their tenacity, their ruthlessness, their ingenuity in the art of war, and their bloodlust. I have never seen a species, so heavily outnumbered, and outgunned, utterly destroy their enemies the way Germanic people did in that conflict. In the centuries since the Germanic Star Empire eradicated the Veltarian hegemony and their entire species, they have carved a mighty empire of their own. One which has evolved at a rapid rate. Technologically speaking, the Germanic race is now at the level of a Tier III regional power. However, their tenacity, ruthlessness, cunning, and ability to do anything to survive makes them capable of contending with even subgalactic powers. You ask why I am so? What was the word you used? Obsessed with the Germanic Star Empire, it is because they are the perfect warhound to unleash upon my enemies. They are a race, born, and bred for the purpose of war. In their society, the individual has no value beyond his utility to the state either as an instrument of war or production. So what if I favor them above all my other vassals? How many of those who swear fealty to our dynasty are able to win 100 wars in less than 300 years? Especially when you demand that they fight against enemies that are more powerful than themselves. The Germanic Star Empire has lost many battles, sure, but they have never lost a war. That is something which the civilizations that have sucked up to us for countless years cannot claim themselves. The fact that you look down on them simply because of the size of their empire is a simple proof that you are still nothing more than a child. But I should expect nothing less than a woman who is not even 1,000 years old. I made you my heir not because of your ability, but as a testament to the love I have for your father. Clearly any one of your sisters would make a better ruler than you. Yet, you still have time to learn and expand your feeble mind. So I won't hold it against you. Celestia had practically broken the skin of her lip, which she was biting into in an act of frustration after hearing her mother's scolding. Though she now had a better understanding of why the woman favored the GSC so much more than any of her other vassals. She still had the feeling that there was something more to it than just the fact that they were an exceptional race of warriors. However, since the Empress did not want to inform her of why this was the case, she would not pry further. Instead, the young beauty bowed her head with fidelity to her mother before departing from the room. Once she was gone, an elderly member of the Light Elven race stepped forward from the shadows, with a peculiar expression on his aging face. He stroked his goatee in contemplation before asking the Empress why she had not chosen to tell her daughter the most important reason for her excessive patronage. I wonder if the reason you waited so long to mobilize the Fifth Fleet was to give your precious hounds an opportunity to expand. After all, you could have dispatched our forces to intercept the Hive Fleet terminus the moment they entered our borders, and yet you let the Rylonians fall. It was only after the supreme leader of the Germanic Star Empire asked for your assistance that you dispatched your fleet. But where was your concern for your vassals, when the Emperor of the Rylonians begged you for military aid? Lunaria scowled at the old sage, who had posed a rather troublesome question to her. Though his assessment of her intentions was indeed accurate, to speak them aloud was nearly an act of treason. After all, if she did confirm this to be true, then the Empress of the Light Elves would be admitting to sacrificing a vassal which had served for her dynasty nearly 1,000,000 years for a recent upstart. If news of this got out, the entire quadrant would be up in arms over such a scandal. But did the most powerful woman in this quadrant of the Milky Way galaxy care about something so petty? No, she did not, and thus she rather shockingly admitted to the whole thing. The Rylonians have lost their last 50 wars with the proxies of those hideous dark-skinned freaks. Meanwhile, as I previously mentioned, the Germanic race is undefeated against opponents who, by all logic, should have emerged victorious. So what if I sacrifice those losers for my precious little puppies? Though all life in the Rylonian Imperium has been consumed by those fucking bugs, it is a simple matter of terraforming before those worlds can be absorbed into the Germanic Star Empire, and if your prophecy indeed becomes reality, then they will have earned such a bountiful reward. Still, it will take millennia for such an upstart civilization to incorporate the vast territory of a subgalactic power, but when they finally do, they will be the most valuable weapon I have at my disposal. The elderly elf simply shook his head with disapproval before voicing his thoughts aloud. In the entirety of the Alphaim Imperium, only those old fogies who called themselves sages could speak to the Empress with such informality. I am beginning to think that your daughter is correct. You have become obsessed with your newest pets. And when your puppies finally lose in battle against your enemies, what then? Will you regret your choice to sacrifice such an ancient and loyal vassal, for the sake of an upstart civilization? Despite the seriousness of the question, Lunaria did not treat it with any urgency, and instead gazed out of her window, into the luscious utopia that was her home world. Whatever she was thinking about in that moment, only she knew. Chapter 12, Beating the Unwinnable Scenario. While the Alphaim Dominion had begun to move its forces against the Hive Fleet Terminus, which was currently causing untold destruction within their quadrant of space, Eric was suffering through his cadet life. Though the administration of the Academy had defended his actions in disciplining the new cadets, who had violated a number of regulations, the people of the Empire had begun to harass the young man all over social media. Naturally, this was the fault of none other than the up-and-coming idol Erica Krieger, who had not only made a particularly vicious post regarding his actions on the video that was taken, but had also appeared in an interview in one of the most popular daytime talk shows, condemning Eric, and people like him for merely existing. Because of this, there was a new intensity in the atmosphere within the Naval Academy, as many of the new cadets who had just begun their first semester began to complain about the unfair advantage that mutants had over them. While they were out starting families, the mutants had already gotten a head start in their academic life. Not only did mutants tend to be much higher on the leaderboard than the new cadets, and even most of the returning ones, but they were also higher ranked in the student body. Because of this, Eric, and those mutants who had ruthlessly pursued their studies like him, were now cadet officers, giving them the ability to effectively control those who had not yet achieved such a rank. Yet this was the nature of the military, and if any of the new cadets dared to give him lip, he could order any number of punishments for them to endure. Currently, Eric was taking a break from his simulation while looking at a post on the grid, on his profile, that was essentially a young woman in her teens telling him to kill himself. She was not the only person who had sent him such a message in the last hour. In fact, if he really wanted to read through them all, he would have millions, if not billions, of direct messages telling him to commit suicide. Despite this, Eric did not really seem to care about the abuse he was suffering on the Interstellar Network. Instead, he focused on what mattered, and that was his schoolwork and simulations. Thus, after sighing his head and turning off the grid, he got back to the simulation at hand. For the past 6 months of his academic life, he had been running the same exact scenario that he had been using since he first stepped foot into the simulator all those months ago. By now he was no longer on recruit difficulty. He had successfully completed the scenario in all of its difficulties, except for one. Realism mode. Until now, 400 years worth of cadets had utterly failed to achieve a victory in this difficulty. In order to achieve a maximum grade, one needed to pass the veteran difficulty, after which, nobody had ever dared to fight the Naraka Hive fleet again. Who would bother enduring such pain and trauma when the outcome was simply predetermined? It was not just starfighter pilots who partook in this scenario. In fact, every specialization which one could go into within the Navy had to go through the apocalyptic scenario, where they would fulfill their role to the best of their ability, and despite this, nobody in the last 400 years had ever been able to achieve a victory on the realism mode. After all, the simulation was designed as an unwinnable scenario. No matter how skilled one was at their job, the entire navy of the Germanic Star Empire was not capable of contending with the Naraka Hive fleet, and because of this, there was no chance of victory. Any attempts to complete the scenario in realism mode would only lower one's grade and ranking on the leaderboard, thus the number of people who had attempted to complete it more than once was numbered in the hundreds at the most. Yet Eric was undeterred. Even after dropping into the bottom 1% of students on the leaderboard, he wanted more than anything to complete this scenario. By now, he had logged in thousands of hours over the last 6 months since he had first stepped foot into the academy, and more pain, sweat, and tears than he cared to admit shedding. He realized that he simply could not beat the scenario in a standard dagger. Thus, nearly 2 months ago now, which was a month after the new semester had begun, he started training with a heavy bomber. Today, however, he had made his load out of the spaceship different from he had normally equipped it with. The bomber did not carry several smaller payloads, instead it carried a single massive torpedo. The strategy that Eric had come up with was suicidal, to say the least. After so many hours of training in the simulator to beat this scenario, the words of his old high school history teacher finally rang through his head. Self-sacrifice is the first principle of civilization. Thus, after nearly 100 attempts so far today, he had still completely failed to achieve his goal. However, as of this moment, when he was in the cockpit of the heavy bomber, he had a good feeling about his chances of success, and thus, he had a wide smile on his face, as he carefully navigated through the Naraku drones which all attempted to tear his bomber apart. Luckily for him, the simulated fighters of his wing continued to clear a path forward, allowing him to focus on his one and only goal. 10,000 kilometers became 6, and 6 became 3, until finally Eric had gotten so close to his target that he could not possibly miss his mark. Knowing that after he fired this torpedo he was as good as dead, there was a sense of anxiety which flooded his body. And yet, Eric still pressed the button of his joystick, which launched his massive torpedo. Time felt like it had slowed down as the torpedo flew straight into the open hangar of Naraku hive ship, which, after thousands of hours of trial and error, Eric had determined to be the one which housed the hive queen. Suddenly, a massive explosion occurred. The blast was so exceptional that it consumed the entire hive ship, which was practically the size of a dwarf planet. The antimatter torpedo which Eric had launched was not supposed to be wielded by heavy bombers, but could be modified to do so in a time of need. In fact, the parameters to equip the torpedo to the heavy bomber were not even in the simulation. Instead, Eric had used his cyberkinesis to modify the scenario so that he would be able to gain the authority to attach such a destructive weapon to his bomber, albeit after much effort on his part. This torpedo was nicknamed the World Killer by Germanic Star Empire and was designed to blow up planets which were determined to be incapable of saving for whatever reason. That's right, the Empire would rather blow up its own worlds than allow them to fall into the hands of another race. These torpedoes were in every fleet, but were seldom used in combat, due to just how powerful they were. The moment the explosive blast devastated the hive ship, it rapidly expanded into space, consuming Eric's entire ship, and engulfing himself as well. But unlike every other time he had perished in the simulator, the simulation did not end with his death. Instead, the battle continued to rage on, as the drones which ravaged the Imperial fleet entered a state of frenzy, where they began to devour each other, as if they were no longer capable of determining who was friend, and who was foe. In the end, a large banner appeared on the screen, which Eric was now watching as a spectator, that said a single word: victory. Immediately afterward, the holodeck shut down, and became just another empty warehouse. The lieutenant who was in charge of the holodeck stared in disbelief at what he had just seen. Normally, it was his job to report any cheating that might occur in the simulator, but he had a hard time arguing that Eric had actually done anything wrong. And thus he watched the entire scene unfold with shock and bewilderment in his eyes. The moment Eric began to cheer in the empty warehouse, the lieutenant quickly contacted his superior on the grid,